Fazlifts is one of the most underrated naturals on this platform. With 25 years of lifting experience and a competitive background in bodybuilding, powerlifting, and strongman, he combines the best of all worlds, mixing old school and modern training methods. His vast knowledge and insights are simply mind-blowing, as you'll see today. He has a unique ability to clearly explain complex topics, making every video a masterclass. Faz is exactly who I aspire to be like when I'm older, someone who always leads by example, constantly learning and improving with a lifelong dedication to health and natural lifting. Subscribe to him now. You won't regret it.
I started lifting in 99. That was sort of my original year. Fortunately for me, I was exposed to some pretty good writers, some pretty good material when I first started. I bought a book called Brawn from Stuart Robert. Great book. It pointed me towards the idea of progressive overload, abbreviated training right from the beginning. But at the same time, the gym that I was going to, the guys there were teaching me about high intensity training. Because where I grew up, it's about an hour from Dorian Yates' Temple Gym. And at the time, in the late 90s, early 2000s, everyone within, an hour radius was just obsessed with Dorian. I mean, like they are now. So all the older guys were teaching me how to train, and it very much vibed with what I was reading in Stuart Roberts' book. So my early education was very much the good stuff. Progressive overload, handful of basic exercises, getting strong, getting jacked, and also an education around good diet. So I was taught a bodybuilding diet very much early on, doing your cardio, all that kind of stuff. So I had a good start, and that led to a fairly rapid burst of strength over the first few years. I went the route of powerlifting. Back then in England, I'm not sure what it was like in Canada, but back then in England, there wasn't a massive drug-free bodybuilding scene. I wanted to compete in something, so I was naturally more inclined to the powerlifting scene. So I went into powerlifting, did that for a fair few years. I competed in powerlifting and strongman for 14 years altogether, from about 2000 to 2014 with my final competition. Also competed in strongman during that time twice. And I competed in a kind of niche sport called grip. Did that for a few years. 2014, ended up retiring from powerlifting. For 4 years, I didn't do a whole lot. That sort of coincided with me starting coaching, because now I felt like my athlete days were gone. But in reality, there was more to come. So I did some coaching, started that while I was still teaching. And then in 2018, I competed in a bodybuilding competition, which was fantastic. I loved it. And the cool thing was, I realized during the course of that prep, it was never so much the powerlifting that I enjoyed. I loved powerlifting, but it was the discipline of being involved in something. And so I loved the prep for the bodybuilding show. It was awesome. It just gave me all that purpose again and drive in my day. And I felt great. And I'm a much better person, much better husband, much better, coach and all that kind of stuff when I'm locked in. So I really enjoyed that. So yeah, I did my last bodybuilding show in 2018. My plan was to compete again in 2020. Didn't really happen because of, world events. And so since then, I've just been really focusing on coaching, which has been great. I've been a full-time online coach for 4 years. I originally started coaching in 2014 after I finished the powerlifting. So I was sort of one of the first, but I coached in a part-time capacity for 6 years before I went full-time. So that's kind of where I'm at now. And YouTube was 2021. And since then it's been fantastic.
You've really done it all. You have the old school and the new school. You competed in multiple strength sports, including bodybuilding, coaching as well. Like, wow. But in that process of powerlifting, you still got quite jacked. Like, how much of a difference would you say compared to your best bodybuilding physique? How was that transition phase? And what did you notice that was different?
I think we could probably put some numbers on it. So I finished powerlifting at a fairly soft 100 kilos, so about 220 pounds, at 5'11". Over the course of 14 years, I competed on stage at 176 at 5'11 in 2018. So big, but not outrageous. So I had to drop quite a lot of weight to get into show condition. I was carrying a lot of body fat. So I think I also gained some muscle in that process as well. So I think I was probably at my biggest in 2018. I probably gained another 5 pounds of muscle, maybe 3 pounds of muscle in those 4 years. So I think the powerlifting did a lot for me. But then I got really strong to get those numbers. I think if I was to give somebody some advice, if they want to just get jacked, they don't care about being strong, I would just pursue bodybuilding. You're going to get a little bit stronger, but the numbers that I lifted, I don't think people need to go quite that far to get.
They were like elite numbers, of course. What are your best lifts in powerlifting, in competition and outside of it?
All my best lifts were outside. So 255 squat, that's 560 pounds, I think. 180 kilo bench. I did that 3 times on 3 separate occasions, which is about 400 pounds. And my pet lift was a deadlift, which is 300 kilos, and that was 660 pounds. So that was all at a body weight of about 200 pounds, 90 kilos.
It's interesting because your ratios are fairly balanced, especially that bench press. Like, would you describe yourself as someone who was not naturally built for it, having longer limbs proportionally?
Absolutely, yeah, definitely longer limbs, which really affects me on the squat. The squat for 255 was an absolute struggle. That was probably my worst lift. The bench didn't seem to be as bad, but I do have the longer limbs. So I don't know, something about my structure meant benching wasn't as bad, but the squatting was awful. I've got very long upper thighs, and for squatting, that's just terrible. But yeah, the deadlift was my pet lift. Love that. I was deadlifting in my peak multiple times a week, heavy, 3 or 4 times. Wow. I was very much on that. From 2010, 2014, there was a wave of high frequency powerlifting in England. Like, all the guys were doing it. It was like a fad kind of thing. I don't recommend it. I don't think it's a good idea because I think it leaves you very prone to injury, but it did get a lot of us very strong.
The deadlift, that was your best lift, and you were training it multiple times a week. That contrasts heavily to your origins of high intensity training. So something along the way, you realized that one set was not enough and that you needed to train a bit more frequently for strength. But how would that later change, the sense that would you go back to lower frequency? Because you said there was a sustainability element to this. What are your current volume recommendations? What are your reflections about all this?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Because I've had the advantage of having coached so many people over the last 10 years, I can see what they can get away with in terms of what's the right balance between staying safe versus making progress. I didn't really care about that when I was younger. It was more about just progress. A pain, injuries, just train through them. Whereas as a coach, I'm a lot more cognizant that there are, we have to work with people and not get them hurt. So right now, what I do probably doesn't reflect what most people should do, because I'm quite an unusual population. I'm in mid-40s, still relatively strong, but also beat up after 25 years. So my volume recommendations for most people that I work with are right in the region of about 8 to 14 sets, 8 to 16 sets per body part per week. Frequency, I would say 2 or 3 times. Closer you are to being a beginner, early intermediate. As you get more advanced, I think we could probably reduce the frequency somewhat or implement some intensity cycling. I think if I was to go back and do all my stuff again, I think I would have gotten a lot. I think ultimately I probably would have ended in the same destination. It might have been in a slightly more comfortable ride. But then again, you can never tell, can you? I don't want to be one of those guys who did something one way and then go back and say, that would have been better. I did what I did. But let's just say I don't train anybody right now how I train myself, because I'm a lot more aware of their safety, and I didn't care back then. So yeah, my recommendations for coaching right now are mostly driven at safety first, then performance, and get them to the goals.
So does that mean, because you said 8 to 14 sets a week, I'm assuming that's not to momentary muscular failure, right? How does reps in reserve and intensity get factored into that?
So yeah, with the higher volume ranges, I try to implement some reps in reserve. So the way that I do it, because I personally really struggle with just the act of doing reps in reserve. I find it very difficult to, in the moment, to kind of hold back. Yeah, so the way that I do it, it's tough. Yeah, it's tough, isn't it? Yeah. So the way that I do it is I use what I call my enforced RIR approach, which is super simple. It's just a name that I give so my clients understand what I'm saying. But basically, it's just doing sets across. So if I have somebody doing 3 sets of 8, for example, with, say, 3 minutes rest, if they do 8, 8, 8, what that means is, to accomplish that, the first set needs to be a little bit easier so that they can repeat that in the second set and they can repeat that in the third set. Now, if you tell me, look, Faz, do 3 sets of 8, great, no problem. But if you tell me do 3 sets at 2 RIR, I'm going to struggle. And I find with a fair few people, it's easier just to give them 3 sets of 8 than give them 2 sets of RIR. So I find with the RIR approach, what you have to do is they have to measure it and judge it, but also you then have to employ the use of down sets, because your reps are naturally going to decrease as well. So it adds an extra layer of complexity. So you might get 8 and then 5 and then do a down set where you reduce the weight so you can keep your reps in range. Now, I just find that added layer of complexity, it's fine. It's not a problem. I don't mind doing it with people, but I just find it's just easier just to do 3 sets of 8. And I also find there's an added benefit of this enforced RIR, because if you're doing that, the first set is always going to look and feel cleaner. You're going to get a slightly better contraction, slightly better squeeze. Just it will be imperceptible on camera, but you'll know. Like, I do it all the time. I'll stay at a weight for 2 or 3 sessions before I go up, and every session it just feels that little bit better. And you can't even tell on camera, but it adds a certain quality to it, which is you can't even see it. And so I find over the course of those 3 sets, you kind of get a balance. Some of the sets, well, the last set is maybe a little bit more aggressive, so you get the reps. The first set is naturally a bit more quality. So I personally think everybody should have a balance of both, because you get some guys who are in the real quality camp, and that's cool. And you get some guys who are in the just lift it camp, and that's cool. But I think as a coach for 10 years, I like to employ all kinds of techniques. So I think with the enforced RIR approach, you get a natural waving of styles of training. So you kind of get the benefit of both, because both camps have got some value. So I think if we can use benefits from both camps, it's a good thing. And that's a very easy way of doing it.
It's an easy, guaranteed way of doing it. And I've kind of stumbled upon the same thing with my 3 sets of 10 at 70%, in that the first set is just blasting. The second set is a little bit harder, but you can still tell that the rep speed's on point. And in the final set, you might be at failure or 1 RIR, but it just happens. And then over the course of 3 weeks or however long you stick to that weight, it just gets snappier and your reps in reserve are just going up. As opposed to, say, 3 sets of 8 to 12, which is the most common bodybuilding practice, that kind of forces higher intensity. In that if you get 12 reps on your first set, you might get like 10 on your second and then 8 on your last, or 9, right? And so the only way to build up from there, by default, it would mean that your first set of 12 has a lot of reps in reserve. So you're sandbagging the first set, so the next 2, you're getting closer. But either way, you're going to have to train to failure or really close to it. Whereas when it's just constant 3x8, you know the first 2 sets are a close proximity to failure. And then the last one, it might be added, but it might not. And it doesn't matter.
When it comes to matching the RIR with the volume, I think that's something which is maybe lost in discussion with this kind of discussion online, because you get the RIR advocates, you get the failure advocates, and I think oftentimes what's missing from the discussion is how it all pieces together, because it's perfectly fine to train everything to failure. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. But it just naturally lends itself to lower volume, lower for you, like whatever your...
You can do high volume if you're training to failure. All out?
Yeah, and then naturally speaking, if you're doing RIR type of approach, you can do a little more volume, which I think for bodybuilding purposes probably does have some benefits. It allows you to have more control over the weight and all that kind of stuff. Now, as it is, I've had quite a lot of success with clients with alternating periods, and I think this is a bit of a gem which isn't talked about very much in the industry. I've done it for years because of my powerlifting roots, and you'll know about it, Alex, because I know you've got the West Side roots. But you can alternate periods of, say, 6 months to a year of higher volume type approach, more density type approach. And I know you used to be a fan of this before, which was the shorter rest periods. Do you remember? You and I are both a fan of that. Yeah.
You did it for years.
I've had a lot of success with that, a lot of success. One of my, the program that I'm most known for, which is the full body heavy light medium, that leverages that a lot. So I think a great thing to do, and now bear in mind, I just want to say for the audience, we're talking about some fairly complex stuff here. For the average guy, just train, right? But if you're really into it, I think I've seen some benefit with clients with alternating periods of higher volume, more density type work. And for that, you have to do the RIR, where the sets across really work very well, with periods of lower volume, going back to my roots, which is the top set, back off set perhaps, or single set to failure with all the intensity techniques. And I think rather than being stuck in a camp saying, right, I want to do this, I want to do this, alternate, and alternate in and give each phase enough time that you can actually make some serious progress. And then when you do switch back, try to have some consistency, because you still want to make sure you're seeing progression. So if you're doing a top set, back off set of squats, let's say, let's put some numbers on it so people understand what we're saying, because I'm not trying to be flippant about what we do here. This is stuff I've done and it works. So let's say a guy's lifting 120 kilos for a set of 8 for his top set, then he's doing 100 for a set of 15 on his back off set, something like that, right? Now, to switch over to a higher volume, more density approach, he might want to just base that off the lower rep set, the set of 8, because no one needs to be doing multiple sets of 15 on squats. That's going to suck. So what he might do is drop the weight a little bit, because if he wants to get 4 sets across, 120 is probably going to be a little bit too much. So let's say he drops the weight to 110, does 4 sets of 8, and that's the start of his base. Then he can sort of build from there. So I think that's a good way of being able to benefit from having both, which I think is nice, because then you don't get pulled into one camp. Typically speaking, if you're the high intensity guy, unless you're really, really suited to it, you will hit a wall at some point. And here's the thing, you've got to kind of know when to switch. I think at a certain point, the high intensity guys, they will reach a point where the weights are just so bone crushingly heavy and they're really, really in tune with doing the low volume stuff. They're very efficient at doing it. It's almost as if the muscular stimulus isn't quite there. They're just getting a lot of joint stress because they're so efficient at the exercise. But the thing is, that happens when you're doing the high volume stuff too. So you get to a point where you're doing the high volume stuff, you're no longer getting great pumps. Everything just kind of hurts because you got so efficient at doing the work. So then if you switch to a low volume approach, you get that benefit. But again, I think the key is trying to find that continuity. So the example I gave there with the bench press, how to convert from lower volume to higher volume and vice versa. I think as long as you maintain continuity, you can carry on progressing. And you only really need to maintain continuity on a few handful of lifts, like what I call your markers of progression. So maybe 3 to 5 lifts which cover the whole body. And the rest of it is all open for grabs. For example, maybe deadlifts you probably wouldn't want to do for high volume, but for low volume, it's probably okay, So as long as you're being sensible with it, and again, this is very high level stuff, like it has benefited my clients a lot. And I just think when you're working with natural clients, there is no stone you leave unturned. You have to use all the advantages, and that's what I do with my clients. I think it's great to be able to use all the tricks, and they work.
That resonates a lot with me, especially with my conjugate background, in that I want to build all the performance elements and maximize my physical development, right? So it's like if you're going through these phases where you do have more high intensity training, you'll make some good gains off that. But like you said, you could hit a wall and you might not have the ability to dial back. In many cases, reps and reserve training, especially for strength, could be beneficial. Now that I'm rebuilding my 405 bench, I realize, hey, that 3x10 at 70%, or leaving like 1 to 2 or 2 to 3 RIR, that had its benefits from a recovery standpoint. Because if you're always going to failure, you might find that you literally need at least 5 days of recovery. So now your frequency is taking a bit of a hit. So there's benefits to both ends. I would say the high intensity training is good for putting on pure muscle tissue. It teaches you how to train hard, which is a lacking ability in this modern day and age, right? You can have months of good progress off that, but if you don't introduce a little bit of volume work, your work capacity might suffer, especially like in a calisthenics context, and maybe even skill acquisition, because that is something that is relevant if we're talking about free weights, for example. To look at powerlifters, for example, they're not training one set to failure because it wouldn't be specific for their needs, right? Or even strongman competitors. So there's a context for everything, but I completely agree that you should mix in both, either through phases, like just dedicated hypertrophy. You're going to spend the next 1 or 2 years getting jacked with high intensity, or mixing it like in a conjugate style, because that too could be done. And that's kind of how I'm training nowadays, Like one day is like a volume day. I'm still training hard, but there's a bit more exercises. I'll still keep in the 2 sets. And then the other day is less exercises, but I'm training with a higher proximity to failure. So you could blend it like that. And then the low rest intervals, people say it's inefficient, but that's a great way to get in a lot of sets. Sometimes you are pressed on time, and if you manage your giant sets correctly or your supersets, like there's a way to structure it so that you don't see so much performance breakdown. And you do get used to it after a certain period of time. And if you're working on your conditioning, like burpees and stuff like that, you might need 15 seconds of rest because that's all it is. So it's fitness, bodybuilding, strength training. They're all different goals, and you got to train accordingly.
Alex, I think you said so many cool things there. Like that was awesome. Like it's literally like you're in my mind. So just going back to what you said there about the value of the different styles of loading. So you said the low volume stuff is for really putting on that hard mass, and I agree. And you said the high volume stuff adds something, and I think so. Now I don't really know what it is, and I'm not sure. When I say I don't know, I don't think anyone knows. But I think that density stuff adds something which we don't really know about yet. Whether it's, and if you look at the world of sort of conditioning, like MMA conditioning and whatnot, they will do different types of cardiovascular work for things like capillarization of the muscles, for oxygen flow, for blood flow. I just think there are a range of supporting structures which are being built when we do density type work. I know for certain there is, because when I go from a period of density work to a period of like high intensity work, I get everything just feels so much easier, and I build strength better. And I always take it back to the beginnings of training. People who tend to do a lot of aerobic or sports type work tend to have preferential development in those areas. So as an example, like give you a couple of examples and I'll give you mine. GVS was a huge sort of endurance guy before he started. I think that's done a hell of a lot for his muscle growth. I think that's conditioned, so providing with the supporting structures to be able to build that much muscle mass. And just speaking from my example, I used to play a bunch of football when I was younger. We're talking 7 years where I was playing probably 2 hours, at least 3 or 4 times a week, right? So a lot of football. Now, I used to fancy myself as a bit of a, I don't know, the guys might not get the reference, but Roberto Carlos, he's a Brazilian footballer, but he used to strike the ball from long distances, and I used to fancy myself like one of those. So as a result of striking the ball so hard, on my right leg, I've got this really hypertrophied rectus femoris. It's really odd looking. It sticks out like a golf ball. And that was all from football. Now, when I trained, it just got bigger and bigger because I think the repetitive striking, the endurance work, it provided some kind of base, which you can't get just from lifting weights. And I think when you are going from phase to phase, this high volume density phase to a more of a muscle building phase, like you say, I just think you set yourself up for better gains. I see it over and over. It works.
Anecdotally, that's what we see. Even some volume data, although I strongly disagree with the data. I think they're making some mistakes there, especially with the types of lifters they select, especially when they call them trained and they're not really, like they're late novices at best. But regardless of the mechanism, because I don't think we know, and I'm not going to try to explain it, what I do know is that it works. And I trained like that for a long time as well. I had a calisthenics background, used to do a boatload of push-ups, dips, and pull-ups. And my 3 best areas, well, I ended up becoming a bench specialist, and my back is my best body part. So it certainly did something, doing thousands of reps of calisthenics across the major movements every week. So, and even like these crazy squat programs where the volume is through the wazoo and you're squatting me multiple days a week, it's not sustainable, 100%. But anybody who tried it will tell you that it adds pounds to your squat. A lot better than doing one set of barbell squats once a week, that's for sure. And, I think the work capacity benefits are underrated because if you're getting less tired, everyone talks about fatigue being a killer of gains. Well, if you're less tired after every workout, isn't that a good thing? Like what I can say is that when I'm in a calorie deficit and I'm getting close to that shredded state, what I believe contributes to the muscle loss is the fact that I have trouble finishing my workouts. If you're feeling depleted halfway through because you have no work capacity, and work capacity is also specific to barbell lifts, if you don't have that, I don't know. I think you're leaving gains on the table, and maybe that's why you can only recover from like 1 or 2 sets. You haven't built enough of a base to handle higher workloads that probably would be to your benefit. Not saying it has to be anything crazy. Like you said, 8 to 14 sets. For me, it's like 6 to 12 sets at the highest, and that seems to get the job done.
I think that's awesome. I mean, looking at your history of videos, you got involved in sort of cardio every day, right, for a long time, which was super motivational for me. I've been doing cardio every day now for I think 14 months, something like that. So at least 6 days out of 7. For me, it's just what I tell my clients is get your heart rate to the right area. I don't really care what people do. So for me, at my age, it's always just either the elliptical trainer, like low stress on the joints, or incline treadmill or the step mill. I'm a bodybuilding bro, so it's like classic bodybuilding stuff. I'm not huge, but at 200 pounds at my age, that tends to work for me. I tried doing running for a long time, but it just hurts my knees and ankles. So
that's the thing with cardio. You have to be selective. It's like sometimes you have these crazy goals. You want to be a hybrid athlete, but then you realize it's affecting your weight training. Like last year I was doing burpees every day. I did it for 67 days straight. And I tell you, Faz, my shoulders and wrists were starting to bother me. So I'm like, this has to stop, because I'm also trying to bench heavy twice a week. Now there's guys who only do that as their activity, right? And they're not pressing heavy in the gym. And maybe that's why they can get away with it. Or they're hybrid athletes, but they're not squatting 500 pounds for reps. They're doing like 315. So it's a bit of a different ball game. Some guys are at the elite level, like Alex Viada, but they really are the exception. All respect to him, but I find it hard to recover. Like you got to know how to program. Everything's got to be perfect. Like your fatigue management, that's the thing. You're adding extra variables that could hurt your progress if you're not careful with the activity. But if you do it right, like just brisk walking, 15,000 steps a day, you're not going to kill anybody's gains, Yeah,
exactly. So like going back to what you were saying with the cardio every day, I think that's a big part of it too. I think if you look at the meta history of like strength training and bodybuilding on the internet, you go right back to the days of early 2000s. It was all about don't do cardio. There's a whole interference effect, and it was very powerlifting orientated. Then I think it was Dan John came along and just basically just pooped all over everyone, and he was shredded and lifting weights and looking like a Chad, right? So that almost brought on a new evolution where we all realize, hold on a second, we're kind of fooling ourselves here. We don't need to be fat and out of shape to be strong. We can actually be lean. And I think over the course of the last, certainly, and I mentioned the last 25 years because the advent of the internet has almost accelerated the exchange of information from different camps and different, different worlds. And what we're seeing is now an evolution towards actually viewing bodybuilders as more as whole athletes. Like, yeah, I think you've got to be fit. You've got to be able to do the cardio. You got to fix your diet. You got to do the high volume phases. You got to do the top end work. I think as it's no longer, you can no longer be a really good bodybuilder and be a one dimensional athlete. And I think if you look at all the top natties, that's what they have in common. They're not one dimensional.
Natural Hypertrophy made a video called Hypertrophy Training is Cancelled. And I agree with everything you said in that video, in that bodybuilders are now overly obsessed about hypertrophy, that it's their only goal. They literally care about nothing else. They don't want to be fit. They don't care about strength. They'll only use the most stable machines, the most optimally aligned exercise. And you know what? If that's their goal, so be it. But I don't resonate with it because I don't think it's necessarily, well, first of all, it's boring and you're lacking in so many other aspects, because bodybuilding used to be bodybuilding. You're building your entire system. Don't you want to have all this at the same time? Like, it just baffles my mind.
I think it's always been around, but my theory with that is the latest resurgence is probably drug fueled. That's what I think. Maybe I'm being a bit sort of pessimistic, but I think if you're on a lot of androgens, you're going to get that nervous system drive, which is going to cause you to get stronger, and you're not necessarily going to need to do the strength work. I think NH, Natural Hypertrophy, is right on the money. I'm a big fan of his. I think he's fantastic. I think he's right on the money. I think it's a drug issue. And I'm just speaking about things I see in England, because there are huge fads of some sort of more science-based evidence fitness influencers that we have around here in England who promote a lot of high volume work. And essentially it's all about just staying safe, which I think is fine for them, but it's not necessarily a concern if you're natural and you need to get stronger. So like we're talking about, I think you have to be more of a holistic athlete. Let's say you're a guy who works in IT, and like you've never really been very physical. Most of your job is spent on a desk. Well, you're probably going to need to try to be a bit more animalistic is in certain parts to cultivate that part of who you are. Like, I have guys on the books who are just so nice, so polite. They work in very professional fields, corporate fields. They've never really had the experience of sort of unleashing the beast, and you have to grow that. And I think that's part of being a bodybuilder. I think you've got to have that side of it. It's everything we're talking about here. So I like I watched that video. I thought he was spot on the money. And I think that's something which 20 years ago, certainly in the area that I grew up in, we just didn't have that. Like, everybody was probably too strength focused because it was all the Dorian, grit and everything. And we needed a bit more finesse, whereas it's almost reversed now. But the internet's a funny thing, Alex. Because of globalization, all fads are active at once. So you've still got those guys.
It's true. Like, I don't know what's more popular at the moment, because yeah, that's a great point. But certainly, high intensity training has made a resurgence in the last, I would say, 2 years or so. But what's crazy is that you've seen this happen 20 years ago, so it's happening all over again. That must be. How does that feel?
It's super interesting for me because it's almost 20 years ago we sort of dismissed those things. I moved on fairly quickly because I was very goal driven and I wanted to be big and jacked. And I realized when that stuff stopped working for me. So I found other solutions, which include high volume. But yeah, it's some of the things we kind of dismissed back in the day was the Mensa approach. I mean, Mensa, fantastic athlete, great guy and everything, great thinker, no disrespect to him. But I don't think some of his later ideas were particularly relevant for, I would say, almost anyone. And to see all that coming around again now, I just find it a bit surprising. I was quite surprised with all that coming over again. But yeah, again, just to clarify, I think a lot of his ideas were fantastic. Certainly his early ideas were really good. Got a lot of respect for the guy. You got to respect the guy. He's awesome. But I think some of his later ideas, some of his more extreme measures, I think were a bit unnecessary. My personal feeling, perhaps I'm biased, is that the Dorian style is probably more ideal for more people.
Yes, I would agree with that. And I think it just boils down to the fact that Dorian had multiple exercises doing one set, and it was pyramid style, especially if you look at his, blood and guts, of course, but even his diaries, that top set is not too far off in weight compared to the last warm-up. So if you really map it out, it's not just one set. Yeah, one set to failure, but you can say those previous sets were close to failure. You're still training hard. If you look at the Blood and Guts program, there's a lot of exercise in there. So he's getting like 4 to 6 sets per body part and pushing as hard as that with those loads. I mean, I can see that working for sure.
Absolutely. I find it really interesting because even now, what Dorian says he did doesn't match what I was taught by people who were taught by Dorian 25 years ago. So I find it really weird. I don't know why it's almost, I don't know. I mean, when you get older, your memory just start to run. But what we were taught by basically Dorian and everyone who taught Dorian back in the Midlands in 25 years ago, what we were taught was literally just what he said was in his diaries. You do plenty of warm-ups. I remember being educated in the gym and I was tired during the warm-ups, and because we went right, like you said, right up to the top weight. The final warm-up set was pretty heavy. In fact, the final warm-up set was probably a stimulative set. It was probably about 2 RAR, and then we rested for a short amount of time. You weren't resting for a long amount of time, and then you did the top set. Now, the top set was characterized as being the working set, not because it was the only hard set, but because a lot of the hard sets were hard. Some of the warm-ups were very difficult, but it was because we went to failure and beyond. Failure was just the beginning. Failure was the beginning. For me, the standard implementation was always failure, 3 4 reps, and then 1 to 3 negatives. That was the standard prescription. So failure was the beginning, and then there was an additional probably 4 to 6 reps after that. And that was on pretty much everything except for squats. If you're on leg presses, depending on how sadistic your partner was feeling that day, like you'd be in for a ride. Failure was the beginning, and you were crawling out of it. So yeah, what Dorian says is the way method now. It's not necessarily what he was saying 25 years ago. And I think I don't think he means anything bad by it. I think it's just memory. But we did a lot of warm-ups. The final warm-up was pretty much what we would class as a working set. The working set was categorized as being extremely intense with lots of intensifiers. We would take rests only really between body parts. So the rest between sets was actually quite minimal. But if we were training chest biceps, which is very common for a Monday, we would take a 10-minute break. We'd set a reception after chest, shoot the whatever for a while, and then we'd train biceps. That was the longest rest we would take.
Interesting. So between exercises and then body parts being the smaller ones, just to finish.
Yeah, between body parts, 10 minutes. Between exercises, very little.
Like a minute or two?
Yeah, not much at all. Certainly, I remember being taught by the gym owner 20 years ago, who was taught by Dorian. Yeah, I remember thinking I need more of a break here, but he's like, go, this is your set. So
yeah.
And then we had to do cardio on top, so you had to be a bit of an athlete. You couldn't get gassed. So
what's fascinating is that you grew up literally around the area that Dorian trained at, and everyone worked out like that, and you actually had a training partner to do the intensifiers. A lot of people are trying to train like that, but they're solo, and it's like they don't even get to experiment with those extra methods. And you did that every single week for how long?
It was about a year, because then I went to university. So all of 2000, I was training that way with my Brawn book as well, but mostly in that way if I was at the gym. Then in 2001, I went off to university. I didn't really have access to training partners. But interestingly, probably a few years later is when we had the advent of the second set, the top set, back off set. I don't know who I'd credit that to, but I think I want to credit Jordan Peters. Either him or he's the one who popularized it anyway. But the reason that came about is because with the advent of the internet, it wasn't just people around our area. It was everybody else was starting to see, look, this is how the guys around Dorian train. But then people on the internet were saying, well, I train on my own. How do I do this? And then they were slowly starting to experiment with, rather than the intensifiers, just do a second set. And that was how it was born. Jordan Peters, I think, if I'm right, popularized it, and that's where it took off. So the top set, back off set approach is evolution from the single set. Not saying it's better or worse, it's just different. I think they both work.
I mean, if you just base it off mechanisms, one could argue that the top set back down is better because there's less central fatigue, because if you're doing one set to failure and beyond, maybe that's harder to recover from. So you'll need like a full week for that. I like it though. I've kind of gravitated more towards high intensity training principles, at least in terms of volume recommendations. I just prefer it overall, but there's still a periodization element, and that's not the only thing I do. But would you be able to briefly cover the top set back down method?
Yeah, I think what you said there, it's definitely true. I think potentially there is maybe less systemic stress because you're not doing all the ridiculous reps to failure and the negatives. The negatives and the forced reps are absolutely horrible. People used to fall out with each other. It was in the gym because They'd get angry at each other. There'd be fights breaking out and everything. But anyway, yeah. So what I think it potentially has as a benefit is you do cover different rep ranges. So which is nice. You can do a low rep range, you can do a high rep range, similar to what you and I have been discussing just now about the sort of the different levels and the different benefits. I think variety is beneficial. Now, yes, it's not quite the density approach versus the high intensity approach, but a set of 5 to 8 is different potentially in what it can offer you than a set of, say, up to 12 to 15, both to failure. So I think you do get some benefits there. And there's a psychological carrot on a stick as well. You know, at some point, your 5 to 8 set will be your 12 to 15 set, and that's kind of a nice goal. So the way that I've always ran it is my warm-ups were minimal enough to get me warmed up, which I think is potentially one of the issues with the approach. But I can talk about issues as I go along. So I would say warm up thoroughly, warm up enough, but keep it on the minimal side so you're conserving strength for that first working set. Now, the first working set, generally speaking, it's going to be in a range of 5 to 8 for heavy compounds. I would say higher if you are doing it for isolation exercises. Personally, even if you're doing a low volume approach, I don't recommend doing top set, back off set for isolation work. I think you're better off doing sets across, but that's an aside, that's your choice. Well, not yours, the viewer's choice. The back off set I would take after a few minutes and aim for a higher rep range, probably up to about 20 as a maximum, but 12 to 15 I think would be a better approach. The problem that I see with the top set, back off set is it makes people just a little bit too focused and performance orientated. Now, what I do with my own personal training, and I teach my clients, the more advanced you are, I want to see somebody stay at a weight for longer. So with my personal training, as in me personally, I will stay at a weight for up to 3 sessions before I move on, even if I get the top end of the range. So, so if I get 3 sets of 8, I'll stick to that. And by the end, it feels great. I'll get a good contraction, everything. It feels fantastic. Even feels a little bit easy. And then I'll move up. And I just find it gives my joints time to adapt to the load. Now, the problem with the top set, back off set, and this is not inherent in the top set, back off set because you can do it correctly. But if I was to give guys a caution for anyone who's watching, it would be to try to have a bit of patience, because the top set, back off set, the way it's presented, certainly by Jordan Peters, he said on a number of occasions, you should be able to see tangible progress every time you lift if you're bulking. I don't think that's true. Like, as a natural, you're not necessarily going to get that extra rep every time, but it can be a better set of 6 rather than a harder set of 6, and that's okay. So I would just say to people, just make sure you're focusing on quality as a variable, not just weight and reps. Quality is a variable. You can just get better. You don't have to get stronger.
Someone who uses that method a lot, particularly in the 5-day rep range, I really resonate with what you're saying. There's a natural incentive to want to move on from that weight because you hit the target, right? Especially if you're in the zone, it's okay, I'm done. Let me microload. And I find that it could be problematic when you're lifting absurdly heavy. And I kind of fell into that trap recently with the bench press. You're hitting 315 in that zone. Okay, I got 8 reps on my first set, 6 or 7 on the second. I'm done with 315. Let's move on to 325. But it's like, did I really have to increase the weight? Because there's nothing wrong with 315. I can still get up to 10 reps, 12 reps, and that's going to be a long journey, better mastery of the form. And that too, how are you doing those repetitions? Could you do it in the same rep range with a longer pause, with a slower eccentric maybe, or just cleaner overall? Because I find you're going to use the most efficient means possible to get that weight up and down, because all you think about is progression. You're going for those plus ones, which, again, there's nothing wrong with, but that's also a double-edged sword if you don't put yourself in check. You can't drop that ego.
Yeah, and we're all, most of us are all like red-blooded males, so we want to get more weight on the bar. We equate more weight with more muscle, but, as you and I know, muscle can only be built at a finite rate. It's only going to be built so fast. So if we're strong-arming the weight on the bar, I think there's a potential for us to hit a wall quicker than we ought to. So, yeah, that's definitely true. Just, as I say, to systematize it, I would say reps, weight, and quality. Have those as variables.
Getting more out of less weight, especially through self-limiting variations. Going back to the whole powerlifting thing, I'm sure that must have been important for you, having long limbs on the bench press. What are your thoughts on doing the same fundamental exercises, but with certain form tweaks that give you a similar stimulus with better fatigue?
Yeah, that was a big part of how I did my powerlifting. So almost always throughout the year, I had a few principles of my powerlifting, and one of them was the majority of work that I did was on close variations. So my best variations, for example, was the close grip bench for the bench press. It just worked well for me. For deadlift, it was always a stiff leg deadlift. So what I did was I had almost like regressions for each main assistance lift. So the bench press was always a close grip, and then as I would be further away from a competition, I would do harder variations of the close grip bench, namely the incline close grip bench. So I could start an off season just almost exclusively doing incline close grip bench, which would build up areas where I was, which suited my benching. So a lot of shoulders, a lot of tricep. Now I would use my 8s, 5s, and 3s kind of routine, which naturally waves volume and reps. And I might do that for 3 to 6 months. And at some point, switch to a close grip bench, ride that into a competition. And then in the competition, I maybe slightly before do some bench peaking. But over the course of the year, the actual bench pressing would be quite minimal. I would have it in usually for practice and technique. But generally speaking, I wouldn't hit the competition lifts in the off season. I would hit variations which I was suited to, and I could do very often for high volumes, and provided the development that I wanted. And I generally found if you target your weak areas, you can generally do more volume on those lifts because they're not super strong. So, doing close grip incline bench, I can do a lot of volume on that and build up the areas that I need to build up. So I did that, and that was one of the principles I used for my powerlifting. So yeah, that, I guess in terms of what you're asking, that's how I did it. I would use regressions. Because the aim was always try to get as much quality work. I mean, I guess in that sense, it's not unlike bodybuilding. You know what Dr. Mike would say. The exercise itself isn't necessarily the point. It's more the stimulus and the sets. So I was just interested in maximizing the number of sets, hard sets I could do per week. The actual exercise, it wasn't that much of a concern. It was a relatively closely related lift to the main lift, but I was still practicing the main lift on the side.
Similar enough and had good carryover, which the close grip bench did. You get more range of motion, a little bit more triceps, especially for your style. You weren't like a super wide grip presser with a big arch, more old school, right? And regardless, you're going to have a long range of motion. There's going to be a sticking point just because like you need crazy acceleration off the chest, right?
Yeah, the bench for me is pretty much a longer range. The close grip bench for me is pretty much a longer range bench press. I found my chest was working just as hard as I would bench regularly. And I would bench, fairly tucked elbows, close grip bench with fairly tucked elbows. So really, it was just a longer range of motion. It was a perfect assistance lift. And then the incline close grip was perfect for that. But the other thing I would do is I would do singles year round. And I know we had a brief back and forth on a video recently. Big fan of that. Love that video you put out because it was completely my experience as well. And so when I was powerlifting, I had a range of different principles, like top-down principles, which I thought were key. One of them was singles, because in my mind, if I'm a powerlifter, I should be doing singles year round. That was the general thought process on the British forums back in 2010. You're a powerlifter. Like, what's the point in doing 3 months of 12s and then 3 months of 9s and whatever else? For all of us, usually, the younger guys at that time, we were in our prime. The idea was make sure you're accustomed to doing singles. So generally speaking, I would hit singles on those assistance lifts. So whether it was an incline close grip bench or a close grip bench, I did do singles on stiff leg deadlifts as well. Wouldn't recommend that for most people, but I did it. Before that was also deficit stiff legs, rack pulls, that type of thing. The singles were a hugely influential in my training. And it was almost always towards the end of my career when I was stronger, it was singles on the very
interesting. And that allowed you to stay injury-free throughout this entire time, right? You never had a shoulder problem or anything like that?
Oh, no. I think with regards to injuries, Alex, I think we all like to think what we do is the safest. Like we saw with sort of GVS recently, poor guy had a hamstring, had a calf tear, and he trains in a very safe way. I think we all like to think that what we do is the safest thing, and I did as well. And it is, but at a certain point, some days you get the barbell, and the other days the barbell gets you. It's just the way it is. So I didn't do anything that I thought was massively reckless. I was chasing elite strength, so you have to make some sacrifices, but I wasn't doing anything out and out dangerous. But over time, I think, father time gets you, and it's one of those things. Those injuries will be almost inevitable, but we try to do what we can. And I don't, for the record, I don't think singles are any more dangerous than anything else people do. And you could argue singles are safer. I always felt safer doing one sharp single than I did doing a set of 2 or 3. For me, it was either singles or it was high reps, like 8s. So
yeah, well, look, that's been my experience as well. With higher reps, It leads to potential form breakdown. And that's when all the overuse creeps up. And most people get injured in volume phases, not when they're peaking, at least in the natural circles. So that's been my observation. But yeah, I think we like to think that our training style is keeping us injury free. That probably is true to a certain extent, but at the end of the day, you never know. There could be random injuries. There could be things that are outside of your control and you never saw it coming. Or maybe you were just so stubborn that you just pushed through the pain and it got the best of you. So it could be mental as well.
Yeah, I think with guys like you and I think we're definitely 10 steps ahead of the average Joe at the gym. So what we're doing, we think about what we're doing, we watch YouTube videos, we take an interest. So we're inevitably going to be doing things in a safer way, of course. Sure. So once you're over that initial hurdle, I think after that it is just a game.
Yeah. That said, so you mentioned what has your experience been with it?
I've been a big fan. I was a big fan of Louis going right back to the early 2000s. I'm absolutely gutted, actually. I was in Columbus when I was 16. This was before I got into weightlifting. So I got into lifting weights a year after I was in America. I went over to visit my sister. She was living there at the time. And I was absolutely gutted because I could have met him. But I only got into lifting the year after. So I was really into Louis, late 90s, early 2000s, hugely. And you might remember, like back in those days, they were so big. Even CrossFit was employing conjugate style things. This was before Ripto got his teeth into CrossFit and everybody was doing Ripto squats. Before that, they were actually fonder. In the early days of CrossFit, they employed conjugate because online, everybody was doing conjugate. The website that we all used to go on to in the early 2000s was deepsquatter.com. That's still up. And that had a ton of articles from Louis. So that's everybody online was really into conjugate at that time because Louis was pumping out a bunch of content. So you couldn't help but be impressed. I want to try it out. So yeah, I tried conjugate many times early on. I think later on, I settled on my own version. There was a need for some type of continuity. So like you were doing the benches for sets of 5 and running that in the background. I think that's a great way to do it. For the way that I dealt with it was I kept my main variation in for longer. So I did sort of 3 months of the incline close grip bench, 3 months of the close grip bench, 3 months of the bench, and that as kind of a main lift. And that was how I did things alongside the singles and the 8s, 5s, and 3s. So yeah, I think that one of my earliest lessons with that was I was on the forums in the real early 2000s. This is when I tried conjugate and I didn't know anything. I was just a kid, and I was running a regular approach. I was running my high intensity approach, and there was another kid alongside me. This fella, I forget his name now, Polish kid, I think, and he was running the conjugate program. Now he was a fair bit stronger than I was. We were about similar size, and I remember him maxing out after 6 months and regressing because he did a lot of variation and not enough continuity. And that set a sort of spark in my brain. And at the time, discussions were going on in the forums about the lack of continuity being a problem. So what I decided on, what we all decided on, was there has to be some type of continuity. Now, whether that's keeping the powerlifts running in the background for repetitions, which is what you're saying, or whether what I was doing, which was adding them in for speed work and keeping the variations in for longer periods of time more consistently. I think like there has to be an element of continuity. I don't know why. But for familiarity perhaps or practice. But that's what we found. That's what I found worked. Having some elements of commonality to see you through. Maybe it was just a psychological thing. I don't know, because you had that to aim for psychologically, and you had to progress every session, and it wasn't just random. But that's what I settled on eventually. And when I was still doing a lot of powerlifting coaching, I do less these days. But when I was fresh out of powerlifting, my earliest clients were mostly all powerlifters. That was the system I employed with them.
What would mainly differ is how long you kept the movement in. In my case, like the secondary lifts, I'd probably keep it in for 3 weeks. But all the accessories that came after could be 4 to 6 weeks. And you know what? Sometimes even 3 months. But I would never push it past that point. And that would probably be the limit, again, because of overuse. I think it's like very bodybuilder approach is the way that you mix it in with the continuity.
I think the defining difference between you and I with that was the use of deloads. I would deload quite a lot, and I know you would do the waves. So I think that kind of is why we differed.
That's true. The only time I required frequent deloads is when I was doing a max effort twice a week. There it was like every month or every 6 to 8 weeks. But you know what? You have a point. If you keep the movement in for longer and you focus on slow progression, then you just throw in some deloads here and there. You don't have to rotate as frequently. But what you did rotate frequently was the max effort singles. So I think that's where you got that blending element. So you were learning how to strain and then just focusing on double progression or whatever. and it just blended everything nicely.
Yeah, and I don't think there's any better or worse approach. I think they're both valid. Like we were talking about earlier with the RAR and the high intensity and the volume, it just matches whatever your current thing is. So I think they're both valid. I can logically see how they both work, which is one of the reasons I liked your naturally enhanced routine early on, because I could see the problems that you were tackling, but you had your own way of doing them. It was the same problems that I was trying to tackle. I just had my solutions. So I really liked that program. And I did a review on it very early on when I was on YouTube in 2021. You've seen all the problems that I've seen, but you've got your own way of dealing with them. I thought it was fun.
I have a different background than you. Like, I didn't grow up in those early forums, but I got to read all the articles later on. So, I would spend days just start to finish, When I was coming up in strength training, this is when conjugate was losing its popularity. So I'm getting like the tail end of it, and people are now starting to criticize what the problems are with it, right? So because I got to see the criticisms right away, like I'm talking day one, I'm like, okay, I'm going to read Louis' work, and then whatever he says is being criticized, I'm just going to scrap that. And that's how it works so well. So in a sense, I'm not a pioneer, right? Of course, I've learned, I've experimented. You do need to do that with this system, but it was coming on the tail end, where guys were saying this is not going to work if you're doing it raw, so I didn't abuse the box squats. I didn't abuse the partials or the accommodating resistance. It was all mixed in, but it was done in a more tasteful way. What kind of system did you find work best just for getting strong? Like if you wanted to coach me, for example, in a non-conjugate way, like what kind of routine would you recommend, periodization style, etc.?
So the routine that I followed I guess there was 2 periods of my life where I did a lot of powerlifting. Initial period, which was from about 2000 to 2006. Then there was a period of 2010, 2014. Both were very productive. They were just different periods of my life. One where I was a beginner, I was lifting, and I worked up to lifting some reasonable weights. Nothing crazy, but like a 330 pound squat, bench, 500 squat, and about a 550 deadlift. That was my initial like 6 or 7 years. Then I got hurt. I tore a hamstring pretty badly. For about 3 or 4 years, I did my first exposure into bodybuilding, and then I came back, and that's when I did the high frequency powerlifting, which was for about 4 years, and then my numbers were bigger. So both were fine, but I guess with the first 6 years was a very traditional, what we used to call back in the day, the American powerlifting method, which was you have a day for squats, a day for deadlifts, a day for bench, and a day for bench assistance, usually overhead press as well. Like that's what and then a lot of bodybuilding work. Now there's a lot of benefit to that approach. The lower frequency of the lifts means you can really pile on the stress. You can do your singles, you can do your heavy doubles, your triples, and you can do a ton of bodybuilding work. And I think that's a big thing. I mean, I don't know how in touch you are with sort of the modern powerlifting scene, but certainly in England, I think there's not. Bodybuilders will always learn from powerlifters, but in England, certainly, a lot of the powerlifting scene, they don't tend to like to learn from bodybuilders, which I think is a real shame. I think they're missing a lot. Like rep work just doesn't happen. And so one of the advantages of that early system was because I needed to grow. I was just a kid. And so that sort of quote unquote American system was fantastic for me. So it was very typical for me to bench on Monday, go up heavy. Tuesday, the day after, go up heavy on squats, do assistance exercises. Usually for me, that was squat, good morning, leg press, and then a bunch of other stuff. Take a day off. Then Thursday would be the bench assistance, where I would overhead press first. I think if I was coaching you, I don't know. I mean, depends how much you like the overhead press, but I suppose it would be a bench assistance day. I would do the overhead press and a close grip bench as my main lifts with a ton of back work and a ton of arm work. And then on the Friday, it would be the deadlift day. Typically speaking, what I would do is I would periodize and I would alternate week by week. So my main lift would be the deadlift, just periodized. And then I would alternate rack pulls with deficit deadlifts every other week as sort of a change of stress. So that was the typical bodybuilding / powerlifting approach that I took in the early days when I needed to gain muscle, because I was very under muscle when I first started lifting, and it worked really well. It was a great system. Again, with that was also lots of singles. Right from the beginning, I was doing lots of singles, tons of bodybuilding work, and that worked tremendously well. As I say, it got me up to some reasonable numbers, but at a lighter weight. So I peaked in 2006 and 7 at a body weight of about 180 pounds, softish 108 pounds, but 108 pounds with lifts of, about 330 on the bench, 500 on the squat, and 550 on the deadlift. Now, that is one way of doing things. I think the other way that I did things when I got back into powerlifting in 2010 was the much more high frequency way, which was full body every day and up to 5 days a week. When I say full body, I mean squat, bench, deadlift. So I used to lift with a crew, and in the beginning, we were going heavy twice a week, light day on Wednesday. Later on, I managed to work up to doing heavy lifting 3 times a week, light day once or twice, and so that was like how the evolution happened. At my peak, it was heavy 3 times a week for the squat, bench, and deadlift, and then lighter a couple of times a week for speed. And like I've been saying, the lighter days were on the power lifts. The heavier days were on the variations that I enjoyed. So close grip bench, incline close grip bench, purposely trying to deleverage myself as much as possible because I'm going to have to do it all again in 2 days' time, you know? So back in those days, that was the idea, just trying to get as strong as possible. A lot of warm-ups to try and get your joints moving. Again, it's not something I'd recommend to most people. So I probably wouldn't train you that way because I think it's unnecessarily painful and the joints need time to recover. But you got to understand, Alex, back in the day, back about that sort of time, do you remember John Bros, Pat Mendez, his student? So there was a lot of that going on. I think it was Matt Perryman did his squat everyday routine back in the day as well. So that was super popular back then. So it's not something that I would recommend, but we were all the British strength scene back then was all obsessed with high frequency powerlifting. I would not recommend it because the joints are the limiting factor. And I was relatively young then. I was only like 32, 33. So the joints are the limiting factor. The joints just didn't recover from session to session because you're going heavy Monday and then again on Wednesday. Now, Tuesday, you're going light and you're just about breaking it through the session. So I was getting stronger, but the reality was I was getting beat down quite a lot as well. So it's not an approach that I would recommend anyone do. I think high frequency, high intensity, it's just not a great approach. I got strong on it. I got my best lift on it, but it's like that Thanos meme, you know, at what cost? It was a lot of injuries and a lot of joint degradation. So I think if I was to train you now, it would probably be more like the first method, because I don't necessarily see the value of having to do everything twice a week if you are progressing once. Usually the bench press needs to be trained a couple of times a week, but the squat and deadlift, most people are pretty good doing it once. So that initial sort of quote unquote American powerlifting setup was pretty good.
So you just could have refined it a bit better for further gains. The American system that you describe, it sounds to me like a modified upper lower, just that it's not bodybuilding. You know, it's just benching and accessories, a squat day and a deadlift day, and you're hitting everything twice a week with some overlap.
Yeah, I'm training a female powerlifter right now. I've got a few powerlifting clients on the books, and essentially what I do with her is I train. You're going to love this. It's all singles except for bodybuilding work. That's it. It's just great. So when I took her on, she was she'd come off a back injury. So I helped the initial 2 months of working with her was rehabbing the back injury, and I had a look at her programming, and it was she squats in a very sort of butt up way, like a good morning way, right? So she was deadlifting twice a week, squatting twice a week, and that's a ton of stress on the back with the way that she squats, and doing reps as well. So every time, like we've discussed, the repetitions meant that there was slight form degradation. And I looked at a video she was doing before she met me, and I looked at a program and I realized, look, this is the issue. You're getting a ton of work in your lower back, and some of that work is not the best quality. You're rounding your back on occasion. So we switched to all singles. She bench presses twice a week now for. She's only able to train 4 days a week. So she benches twice a week for 6 singles. Then after that, it's all bodybuilding work. She squats and deadlifts 4 singles each. After that, it's all bodybuilding work. I say all bodybuilding work. There is one main assistance that I will have her do for about 3 sets of 3. So for the bench, she'll do a close grip bench. For the squat, she'll do a good morning because it suits the way she lifts. And then for the deadlift, she'll do a deficit deadlift. So it just seems to work out with her. Then she does a ton of, I guess, just literally what they call bodybuilding work. And that's been really good. And what I said before about powerlifters not necessarily taking from bodybuilders in this day and age, she suffered from that as well. She had a previous coach and they did a lot of powerlifting type work. But I got her doing bodybuilding work for the bench press and her bench exploded. Like she's currently benching 80 kilos. When she met me, her best bench is 50.
Well, for the bench press, I feel like it is one of those lifts that you benefit a lot from just pure muscle tissue. And a lot of bodybuilders, they could rep 500 on the bench without even training for powerlifting. Of course, they're enhanced and whatnot, but if you put them on a specific routine, they get freaky strong. So it's not uncommon. Just their baseline is 500 plus, you know? So, yeah, I think that's very important. you need to get bigger on those lifts. And I think the squat and deadlift, especially the deadlift, are a lot more leverage dependent, and you kind of could get away with not like maximizing your size potential for a long period of time. But at some point on the bench, you just got to get bigger, and sometimes that could even be fat gain. You know. Now you mentioned the singles, so 6 sets of 1 on. Is that something you program a lot, and would you like increase that over the coming weeks? Like, would you start with a 3x1, then it becomes a 4x1, or how do you periodize the singles if it's not max effort, rotating the variation every week?
So first of all, I find women can usually handle more because she's quite a small female. She weighs like 225 pounds. I find she can just get away with a lot more singles. She'll wake up from a single and just be like, fine, this is all good. Shrug her shoulders and carry on. But for guys, it'd probably be less. So that's the first thing. In terms of periodization, I don't really periodize it, but it goes back to what we were talking about in terms of quality. So she has to pass the threshold of quality for all singles. So she'll do 6 singles on the 2-minute timer. Okay. I do like to time because consistency. Now, if the 6th single is snappy, she gets up, bang, and it's snappy. And when it's snappy, it's great form, hips push through and everything. All that's fine. Then she's good. She can go up and weight. But she might be on a given weight for 2 or 3 sessions, maybe 3 or 4 sessions before she goes up. But I'm always going to err on the side of it being nice and snappy. I don't like to put a great deal of emphasis on performance for those sets because I think she's fine with it because women tend to be better with this kind of thing. Guys want to just, put the weight on a bar, but she's okay just to pull back a little bit and put more emphasis into the bodybuilding work. So the way she's going, she'll do snappy lifts, which mean that she's not getting any kind of back pain. Even the barbell lifts done frequently for singles are easy on her body. Plus she's getting all the joint and connective tissue strengthening from doing singles. And on top of that, she's doing a ton of bodybuilding work. So it's an ideal system. It works really well for her. So to answer your question, sorry, I don't periodize, stick to a simple amount. But the main variable we're trying to manipulate is the quality and the bar speed and the snappiness. A guy could probably get away with 3 to 5 singles on the bench. But I don't know about you. I certainly wouldn't want to be doing.
Oh, hell no. Oh, so this is done twice a week, the 4 sets of 1.
For her, twice a week, yeah, because she can only train 4 days a week at the moment. If she could train 5 days a week, I would probably have her doing another day of benching. But yeah, so for guys, you could do up to 5 singles, but then I would want you to do squats perhaps once a week, which is probably what I would do with a guy anyway. I'd probably have you doing the squat day, say 5 singles, then a bunch of bodybuilding work. Deadlift day, 5 singles, a bunch of back work, whatever, leg work, hip thrusting work, and then 2 bench days. I might not have you doing singles on the second bench day, maybe just more of a traditional setup. Like you were saying, maybe a couple of sets of 5, or depending on what they like, maybe sets of 8, something like that. But I haven't ran that particular style with a guy yet. I have done it with this female, and she's doing really well. So.
That's what I was going to ask you. Okay, awesome. You would say it's like RP8 or something like that. Like if someone's benching 315 for 1 rep max, maybe they're doing 275. Like maybe they can hit it for 3 reps, but they're just doing 1.
Yeah, and it's a bit more bother because you have to film the lifts, but she's really good because she'll film the lifts and send them to me. And so I can just make sure that they're snappy.
Actually, you did mention something interesting, that you put them on a 2-minute timer. A lot of times you're going to hear 3 to 5 minutes for strength. If I wanted to maximize my bench press, would you put me on 2 minutes still?
I got so much pushback with timing rest periods when I first got on the internet, for me, it was a pretty standard thing. I got on because my wizard program, my full body heavy light medium, it hinges on you timing rest periods. And there was so many people just saying, no, I don't want to do that. I want to rest longer, be strong. And I couldn't understand it. I thought, this works. But I think I use it as a variable. And also I have to bear in mind, in terms of people I coach, it goes back to what we were saying about about lifters being athletes. 2 minutes for you and me is going to be very different from 2 minutes from Joe Bloggs, who has never really lifted before in his life, works an office job, his cardiovascular system is terrible. So I think I want to just try to get people to a better place, because that Joe Bloggs, his work capacity is going to be terrible, which is going to limit him in the future. So if I can get him to time his rest periods, that means he's at least benefiting from getting that additional work capacity exposure, because he's going to be, in my experience, he's going to be limited by his cardiovascular system. So if we can work on that, we can get him stronger overall and safer, I think, too. So he has to be able to hold that position. If he's gassing out halfway through the set or he's approaching the bar tired, we've got to make sure we pull the weight back until he adapts. So I think I would put you on 2 minutes for some, depending on the setup, of course. But yeah, I would definitely want to make sure with an athlete like you, we are taking advantage of your fitness.
If doing the 2 minutes of rest, I'm assuming you wouldn't program 2 sets per exercise. You would, by default, increase the volume a bit, right? Because you can get away with it.
Yeah. So with the powerlifting approach that I've described, do you remember earlier we were talking about sort of the density versus the top sets, and you said a really good point. You said, well, you can do it in 2 ways. You can have it as a block approach.
Yeah.
In this context, we're talking about doing it all at the same time. So yes, you get the high intensity work via the singles, but then the bodybuilding work, that's all the density work. So in that case, yeah, I would, to satisfy everything, then I would put a timer on the bodybuilding work. But to be fair, for the singles, I would probably put them as a timer as well, just because I want them to be snappy. If I give you 2 minutes for 5 singles, you're not going to get enough time to rest that it becomes an ego thing. You're going to have to keep working.
And it's going to force you not to overload. Like they're going to be true, like submaximal singles. So you're not beating down your recovery as well. You're not going to have grinder reps, basically. It's impossible.
I think if you grind, you're just going to work yourself down.
So I think the way you're describing it, the rest intervals is not only about work capacity, but it's also about just having better form. That it factors in load management without you having to think about all these other variables. It just naturally guarantees it.
Yeah, because people will say, well, what if I'm tired? I can't approach the bar after 2 minutes rest. Well, reduce the weight, and then you adapt. The form has always got to be the limiting factor. The form and the time is always a limiting factor. So if you can't do 100 kilos for 5 singles because by the 5th single you're gassed out and you can't hold your position, well, 100 kilos is no longer your working weight. You start too heavy. So start low and your body will adapt. And that's what.
Awesome. How does fatigue play a role in this? Because some people will say that you don't get high motor unit recruitment because you're resting less. Like, what will your pushback be to that?
Essentially, the best way to view the singles is not so much as each single having to have the most motor unit recruitment. View them as a block together. That's what I always tell people. If you're timing them, they're connected. Use them as a block. So your progression hinges on all of them being. And so by the end of that 5th single, you're going to be more fatigued. You're going to be tapping into those bigger units. It's not quite, a set of 10 where by the end you're hitting failure and all the stronger units are firing, but it's similar, it's that sort of concept. So yeah, it will end up working them. And then when you go for a single, it just seems to provide you with more of, it just pretty much provides you with a nice strength burst. So the single seems easy.
Okay, very good. And I just love pressing you on this because it's very interesting to me. And I might even do this myself, So if you were trying to get like a lot stronger right now, you would continue doing this. And you would pretty much keep it at 2 minutes. Like you wouldn't try 3 minutes or above. Just straight 2 minutes all the way through. Keep yourself accountable. Get used to it. Everything's gonna be fine.
I think so. I think like if you and I were training together and we were doing this type of thing, I think we would both be hitting 2 minutes on the clock, and we would be building that up nice and high to the point where things are snappy. Then when we did go for a single, for one, we are adapted to doing singles, so it's not going to be foreign to the body. And we will be able to hit some snappy singles and potentially some grindy signals and do them really efficiently. So it'll work because the weights will be reasonably heavy, but probably more like 85%, I think, something along those lines, something like that anyway. So I think we'll be well adapted. Plus, at the same time, we're getting stronger for reps on all the rest of the work. So I would just say with that, because we're doing frequent work on the power lifts, even though the singles are snappy, we would probably want to employ more reactive deloads if we need to. But essentially, yeah, if you and I were doing that, we would just run those and let bar speed be our guide. So on a day, let's say we're not feeling very well, both we're a bit beat up, we would just pick a lighter weight and we'd carry on doing that. That's what I did. You just pick it's auto-regulation. And and then the next session will probably feel okay.
Yeah. And I guess the way I would do it is with just dropping the percentages a bit. Like if I do 70%, it's going to be too difficult with the 2 minutes. So I might dial it back to like between 60 and 65. And that would have the same training stimulus. And I would argue probably the joints would hurt less as well.
In my experience, over time, you'd probably have to handle a larger percentage over time. I think you'll get a better ability to be snappy and grind, I think. Not grind. You'll have your ability to hit those singles will get better. So that's been my experience.
And for the isolation lifts, would you program it the same way? 2 minutes for like a barbell curl?
That prescriptive with that kind of stuff. I think so with this kind of program, the way that I've got this girl doing it is 3 tiers of the program. You've got the singles at the top, you've got the 3x3 main assistance, and for that it's fairly long rest periods as well, 2 minutes or so. And then you've got all the rest of the work. All the rest of the work, I would just say, hit a certain number of sets. And because a lot of it is the density work, again, matching the high intensity with the high density, then 2 minutes kind of makes sense.
Well, thanks for sharing that. And I'm probably going to try this out, and you'll be the first to know how it works out. And you'll get that credit because I trained like that for a number of years. It was similar, with my like alpha body style. But then somewhere along the way, I started resting like 3 to 5 minutes. And when I benched 4 or 5 in 2021, it was literally 5 minutes every set, sometimes even 8 minutes, if I'm being honest with you. But the workouts just became so long, and I feel like the work capacity did take a hit. Then you have to do separate work on the side, but then that affects your recovery. So it's like, I'll let you know. What about the once a week training ideology, assuming that volume is equated? And how has that changed in your journey, especially as you got older? Because you mentioned that even 32, 33 is still young. Like, what do you define as an older lifter? And when do they have to start dialing back the frequency?
So I think at some point you will have to dial back the frequency because in my experience, as I got older, the difference in recovery between my joints versus my muscles seemed to expand. Like the time frame of recovery seemed to expand. Now, I don't know whether that's just because of my age or whether it's because of my training age. I've been training for 25 years at this point. I'm relatively strong. I mean, a beginner in their mid-40s, I can't see them needing to train a body part once a week, I think they can get away with training twice.
I think it's both in your case. Because you got elite numbers. I'm still relatively young. And I'll be honest, Faz, I have a hard time recovering now. Like, even compared to 3 years ago, it's not the same. And I don't think it's because my body has somehow drastically aged or anything like that. I really do believe it's the absolute load on the bar. That combined with the age, that must have been a factor. Like you said, someone in their 40s who's lifting novice loads, I don't see that being an issue. They can probably bench 3 times a week and be fine. Yes, with his formula on muscle potential.
Yeah. So he was the guy who initially educated me on the differences between muscular recovery versus joint stress and everything else like bone stress and nervous system stress. So I mentioned that I had a hamstring injury in 2006. So I contacted Casey because bear in mind at this point, 7 years powerlifting, don't care about physique, but the doctor's telling me, look, no more powerlifting. Tried it for a while, kept getting re-injured. Contacted Casey because we were on talking terms back then. And I said, look, can you teach me about bodybuilding? And so he taught me how to do the heavy, light, medium system. And he said, we do the heavy, light, medium system because you can train the muscle more often, but you cannot load the ligaments more often. And that was the first exposure where I was starting to realize it's not just a one-factor recovery model.
Yeah. Some current practitioners who are now talking about their new evidence-based protocols, it's all circling back. Like they're not learning these mistakes. I'm seeing high frequency, high intensity combined. When I look at it, it's like, eventually I know they're going to change your position because guys are going to start burning out.
You got to, yeah. Eventually, it doesn't work. So yeah, he was the guy who originally started talking to me about it, and then I've been cognizant of it my whole life, and it kind of led me down that road of looking at the high density and the high intensity. It just naturally lends itself to work. So yeah, sorry, what was the original question?
Yeah, so how frequency changed with age? At what point does that become relevant?
So I found early on I was aware of it, but it didn't really affect me that much. And so for those years, I was aware of it. I was putting it into place, and it worked really well. I was able to train body parts 5 times a week during my high volume bodybuilding phase between 2007 2010. Now, I was so conditioned. I think that was in part responsible for my massive burst of strength from 2010 2014, where I hit my big numbers. Because, like we've been going back to the start of the discussion, I think just something happened in my body. I think I'd built all the supporting structures, the capillarization or something, whatever it was. But my body responded very well. Now, I was still relatively young enough that I could just about get away with the high volume, high frequency. But again, I was getting injured quite a lot. As I got older, and as I'm just a lot more risk averse now, I'm a lot more aware. So I think, yeah, you've got to employ a couple of strategies. Over the last 2 years, my frequency has dropped from twice a week to a body part every 5 days to now a body part every 7 days. And I feel great. In fact, I actually feel my joints getting stronger every week, which is Very good. So I think at some point you've got to resort to that, or you've got to heavily periodize your work. So if you still want to train a body part for whatever reason, every twice a week, let's say, you're going to have the second day as a light day. It's going to have to be sets of 15 rather than sets of 5 to 10. You're going to have to. But at a certain point, you're not going to be able to do that anymore either. And I would argue, if you're going to do that, what's the point? Just go heavy, but do it once a week. And then in that once a week training, do some heavy work and do some lighter work. Like as an example, I do chest and calves on Sunday. I'm always going to start off with something heavy, and then by the end of the session, I'm going to be doing something like 3 sets of 15 on a chest exercise. So I get a range of different stimulus. Again, everything we've talked about in this podcast is having that range of stimulus, the lower reps, the high density work, having it all in your system. Just depends on how you add it in, whether you do it on the block system or whether you do it all in one day or all in one block. But yeah, I think for the older guys who are in my position, and even for guys like yourself, you're not old, but you're strong and you've been lifting for a while, just be very cognizant of your joint recovery.
That's what I'm finding to be the limiting factor these days. I can bench heavy on Monday and my chest is 100% recovered by Thursday, but the surrounding structures are not, and I feel it. And I find that if I take 5 days of recovery, for example, like I'm exceeding my 72-hour rule, but my joints are better. It's weird how this happens to us, but it's something that is inevitable if you've been training for a long period of time and you're lifting heavy. I want to know then, like if you manage all these variables correctly, because eventually you can't do it twice a week as well. Like that'll stop working, right? Like every 5 days becomes more reasonable. So by default, aren't you going to be running like an asynchronous split?
I think every 5 days was a stepping stone to every week. So I ran a split where I was training every day. Normally I like to train 6 days a week. So I ran a split where I was splitting the body into 4 areas, and I was training 6 days a week. So again, it was about every 4 or 5 days. And that was fine, but I lasted for about a year, but I was getting slight pec strains, slight knee issues. So moving to everything once a week for the last month has been fantastic. But I just want to say at this point, that is not how I built my mass. So I wouldn't recommend, because I get a lot of questions because people, they almost want affirmation for their once a week training. And that's fine. Like I don't, want to, if people want to train once a week, that's okay. But all I would say is like, the way that I built the majority of my muscle mass was training body parts multiple times a week. So 2 or 3 times. So I think not you, but if you're like, if somebody listening is a young YOLO, 20 years, 25 years old, and is not as strong as we are, they're probably going to be better off training body parts multiple times a week. But certainly as you get older, as you get stronger, like you're experiencing now.
Well, look, I think what you said made about the heavy day, light day, asynchronous split, that's really the only way to do it.
Yes. So I was thinking for you, maybe something like my wizard routine where you do, say, a true heavy day. And I know you've got the endurance to do it as well. You'd be able to get through a heavy day, a proper heavy day. Let's say you do it on a Sunday where afterwards you can just chill out on the sofa, relax, eat food and just relax. And then Tuesday or Monday, you do a lighter day. Maybe a day or two after you do a medium day, which is more of a bodybuilding type of day for sets of 8 to 12, and then maybe one more light day. So you're training your body parts 4 times a week, but you're not stressing your joints out. I think you could do that at the way you are currently, and you would benefit from the higher frequency. But again, I think if you are running into joint problems with that, potentially look at timing your rest periods, being a little bit tighter with rest periods on a heavy day to reduce the load. But you can certainly get stronger in that paradigm. So if you didn't want to go for the whole everything once a week, if you want to train more often, that would be a great way of doing it. The way that I do it is somewhat similar to Scott Stevenson's fortitude training. He just has it different systems, but essentially similar kind of thing. Full body, 3 or 4 days a week, just providing different stimulus. And this is nothing original with me. Casey taught me everything. So I've just expanded on that system.
Must have been such a privilege, eh? Well, working directly with him. Like I didn't even know that about you. That's insane. He is a legend. Yeah. He wanted
to write a book. And I thought at the time, I honestly thought if he had released a book, that would have been the best book on natural bodybuilding ever.
I think he has the best standards on natural muscle building potential. Like if you look at his calculator compared to the FFMI calculator, it's a lot harder to reach. Like I still haven't hit those numbers yet. So I think that's very encouraging and what he did is he compiled the best Mr. Americas from like the 1940s and stuff like that, right? And his FFMI conclusion was like, whoa, like naturals can get pretty freaking massive. On that note, like when do you think, and I want to touch upon what you said earlier. I want to go back to it, but at what point does a natural physique really start to peak? I know in powerlifting, it's around 35 years of age. Would you say it's similar with bodybuilding? Like, at what point it's like, okay, you're not going to be building that much muscles. It might not even be a pound a year kind of thing. Like, not your limit, quote unquote, but if there is one, you're pretty damn close to it.
I think if you can survive past your early 30s, then you can peak later on, like late 30s. I say survive because what I've seen is guys in their late 20s, early 30s, that's when they start to pick up injuries. And I say this as a word of caution to everyone, but again, it's like we talked about earlier. Everyone thinks their system is going to keep them away from injury, but Father Time will get you. And I think as you get older, you get into that range of your early 30s, and you do start to pick up your very first few niggles. You have to really take that seriously. And I think unless you have really serious goals of being a strength athlete, I think at that stage, it's in everyone's best interest to look at ways to increase SFR, and really move to more of a bodybuilding type approach to maximize muscle, thinking about the next stage of your life. Like, you want to be 40 and 50 and jacked without injuries. So your metabolic rate is very good. So you can minimize fat and you can be more muscular in your old age. So you're not as prone to falls. And I know that sounds a bit dramatic and everything, but it's a concern, it's just something I think people should think about. So I just think guys who are advanced athletes in their early 30s, they'll start to pick up one or two little aches and pains and they just kind of brush it off. For me, that was the beginning of the end, where it was like, okay, you're getting a small injury, then there's another and another and another. And I thought I brushed them off because that's who I was. That's who I am. Injury in a way, I'll rehab it, I'll run through it, I'll just bulldoze through it like I do everything. But at a certain point, Father Time wins. And I think the way that the very people who say their approach will keep them injury free are the ones who will get bitten by this, because they'll think I've got it, but they'll think I'll just bulldoze through. But those are the ones that get it. The ones who are a bit more cautious, I think they have a better chance of doing well and fulfilling their potential when they're older.
Wow, that's a lot to think about. But I think you're right. We go through our 20s thinking we're unbeatable, that nothing can possibly happen to us. And then you have these little nagging pains that creep up. You're like, oh, it's nothing serious. I'll get through it like every other time, right? But the game has changed, especially with life responsibilities. Some people are not as obsessed as they were when they were younger, or they're starting a family and maybe the recovery is not optimized anymore, and in general age and the absolute strength. So it's like you got to start thinking about balancing all these elements, especially if you want to last for another decade or two at the minimum, because we didn't get started to just put on muscle in our first 5-10 years and then, okay, it's done. Like, we're here for the long game.
The irony is the very attitude that makes you so great,
it's the one that can,
which is the attitude that will break you in the end. And that's it's everyone has that. It's so difficult to flip that switch and go, right, this is when I need to change. It's like, no, give me another year. I'm so close to that new bench PR. Give me another year. So I don't think anyone's gonna get it, because we wouldn't be the people who we are, driven to be strong, driven to achieve, if we didn't have to go through that evolution. I just know that it can be a potentially painful.
That's true. But I think that's why it's important to have, mentors who've either learned the hard way or they got really damn close to getting hurt and they were able to prevent that. And now they live to tell the tale. And I think you're a perfect example of that, being in your 40s, who's probably just as jacked as when you were at 38, but now you don't have these injuries. Or would you say you're maybe a tad bit weaker? But you've also dropped your body weight, though, so you're not that fluffy powerlifter guy anymore. So you're in a different stage overall. But like, you're still making progress now, right? It's just at a different rate.
Probably slightly downsized from 2018, 19. I had some ideas to downsize going into my 40s because just I thought maybe it's safer. And then obviously with the world events that happened, but no, I did maintain a lower body weight for a while. I'm now back up to about 90. And I would say almost as muscular as I was in 2019. The difference being I had a lower back injury, which I suffered from a biking accident.
Yeah.
25 years of lifting is a biking accident. So that's definitely made my lower body somewhat downsized. But yeah, I'm pretty close. I don't see there being too much of a need for me to stop doing what I'm doing.
It's not a significant difference at the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for the average guy, as long as you stay healthy and remain injury-free, you can carry on gaining.
Wow.
The current fad is TRT.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. A lot of guys are getting on TRT at 30 years old or even less. Like recently, a popular influencer, you might know who I'm referring to, he got on at 24 years old. And to me, that's mind boggling. And the way that he justifies is well, if I'm trying to maintain a shredded body fat, then I'm going to experience all those negative side effects because my T levels are down. But if I get on TRT, now I can have the look and feel amazing. But it's like you could have just gone up to 10, 12% body fat, still look lean and aesthetic, and you wouldn't need that until who knows how long. There's going to be times where you don't feel your best, but that shouldn't be your first resort.
It's like the midlife crisis for men now. Rather than buying a fast car, they just get on TRT. So I think if there's a legitimate need, fair enough. But 24 is just insane. I think that's not very well thought through. On that note, I think if you're living the lifestyle, if you're paying attention to diet, I think you can be nice and healthy well into your 30s, 40s. And if there is a time, it's a lot more common, I think, for regular people to be looking at TRT in their 50s and 60s than it is in the 20s and 30s, you know?
And I don't have a problem with that. If you legitimately need it and you've tried everything to get your numbers to regular level and it just doesn't work, and you feel like your quality of life could be improved and you get proper doctor supervision, and it's not an excuse to get on steroids or run these high dosages. Because even that, like these influencers are like, oh, I'm on TRT, and they're taking like cycle doses, right? But if you do it like the real way, like in a non-lifting context, and you're an older man, like, okay, I'm not going to knock that. I feel like that's not what we see in this industry. And it's become glamorized to a point where it's concerning.
You know what it's like, Alex? The power of the mind determines quite a lot about how we perceive things. You know, perception is reality. And if you're thinking, oh, I've got low test and that's the reason why I feel terrible and I'm in a bad mood, then you're going to feel terrible and be in a bad mood. But if you're like, I'm a generally pretty positive guy, and that's what I pride myself on being. I like to be positive. I like to be, because not only for other people around me, you know, I don't want to be miserable to people around me, but also for my own temperament too. You know, I think it's healthy to be generally positive.
Of course. What's the alternative?
It just makes for a nicer life, I think. And I think if you're down in the dumps thinking, oh, TRT is the solution to all my problems, I just think it's a little bit misguided. They'll probably get on and be just as depressed because it's more of a mindset issue.
Yeah. Like assuming you have no prior mental problems and your life is like, if everything in your life is really amazing, you're maxed out and you're still like depressed, then maybe it's a hormone issue. But I don't think that's the case for most men. And even then, like they might be on the lower end of testosterone levels, but it's still normal, quote unquote. And they can still put on a lot of muscle mass. Like I believe Matt Wenning, he did a 500-pound bench press and his T levels were in the 300s. And some guys would be like, oh, he's got to jump on right away. But he was still able to produce world-class numbers without that. And then obviously when he hopped on, he added 120 pounds to his bench. But just to say, like, you can probably get elite numbers even with low testosterone. And there's even some actual natty shredded influencers who are decently strong. They're putting up advanced numbers. Of course, they'd be a lot stronger if they were at a normal body fat, but they're not doing too bad. And I myself did a 3-plate bench at 7% body fat. I felt not the best. Well, obviously, the moment you gain that weight up, your numbers are climbing. But I think you can go quite far even with a non-optimized hormonal state. You know, and you shouldn't be depressed either. It's more the fact that you have to adhere to this dietary restriction and discipline that comes with it, you know?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I don't think it's that much of a factor, certainly not from what I've seen. On my Instagram, on my pinned post, the guy on the right-hand side who's very, very shredded, he was worried about his testosterone levels and he took a test and he was something like 400. But he looks like an absolute Chad. You know, he's just huge and lean all year round. And he's not like he's at the top of the range. So I just think that's a bit overplayed. It's one of those things where if you're feeling like a little bit, we all get a little bit down and tired and all that. It's just normal. You're not supposed to feel like Superman all the time. There's just somebody to say, why don't you try and take this? You'll feel better. And I don't know. I think a lot of it's very misguided.
Actually, I'm curious. Do you think there is an actual limit?
The Natty limit, currently, a lot of people still think it's 25 FFMI. That's the figure that seems to be quoted, was quoted for a long time. And a lot of those people say they've read the research and it's research-based. Actually, the latest research points to 28 or 29 FFMI, I forget, as being the largest record.
Yeah.
You know, and that's massive. That is absolutely enormous. I mean, 25 is massive. So I think I was 22 or 23 FFMI when I competed. I'm a big boy. So, you know, that's like 176 at 5'11". So in terms of 25 being a limit, I that's definitely not. That's been blown out of the water. It's more like 28. So I think for most people, practically speaking, it's more about staying injury free, longevity, which goes back to my discussion about people in their 30s. Unless you're really into strength, at that stage, your joints will let you down. So focus on bodybuilding. And bodybuilding is still going to get you stronger. It's just not going to, we're just not talking about singles and doubles. Bodybuilding done correctly is still going to get you stronger. Just give up any ideas of powerlifting and stuff at that point. And maybe that's a bit of a strong statement, but if bodybuilding is your priority, I think it's in your best interest to let go of any side projects of powerlifting you might have. But obviously, if powerlifting is your thing, then of course carry on. But I think longevity is the big thing, and I think for most people, they're not anywhere near as focused.
Yeah,
I have fairly extensive warm-ups that I use with my clients as part of my coaching, and they're all expected to do warm-ups specifically for some for the upper body, some for the lower body, because a lot of injuries are just people not warming up correctly.
Would you be able to take me through what one of those warm-ups would look like on, say, the big three?
Yeah, sure. So if you are doing anything with upper body, I would have people doing 3 exercises for about 3 to 5 sets of 12 to 15. Those 3 exercises are a face pull done like this, like a rotator cuff face pull, push downs and curls. So you're just warming up that area. And on chest days, I might also do some additional flies as well, normally in between the first few warm-ups, just to get things warmed
What about
up.
upper back?
Yeah. So, and then on lower body days, it's always leg extensions and hyper extensions. Again, 3 to 5 sets, 12 to 15 reps. On top of that, then you do your traditional warm-ups, and that's the way I go. The protocol gets progressively more and more cautious for the older and stronger lifter. Like for myself, I do that. I do extensive warm-ups. I also pyramid up in weight. So if I'm doing a top set of 12 for my first working set, I'll do warm-up, 1 set of 12, second set of 12, and I'm not going to drop the reps. So you know how some people will drop the reps on the wall.
Yeah, they'll do like 10, 8, 5, 3, 1. So you'll keep it the same.
And on top of that, the first working exercise is going to be an isolation lift, like a pre-exhaust. So it's going to be on chest day, it might be a cable fly. So a typical chest day for me would be the 3 preliminary exercises, then going to the cable fly, working up to, say, 3 sets of 12, but doing 12s at a warm-ups all the way through. And then after that, I do my heavy press. And my heavy press means I'm down about 20 kilos than if I lifted when I'm fresh. But my joints feel great because I'm taking my chest to failure while not having to lift 20 kilos more load. So that would be what you do for upper body days. For lower body days, it would be leg extensions, hyper extensions, and it just helps to get things warmed up and moving, knees in particular.
Talk to me about the winning warm-up, right? You're basically doing the same thing. But then you added on the pre-exhaust, and then the other element, I'm assuming, is the higher reps, right?
Yeah. I'm quite a big fan of Wenning's training protocols. I like him a lot. So yeah, he has his Wenning warm-ups. Mine are my specific brand. But yeah, I found that to be helpful. I found the pre-exhaust helpful. And yeah, like you say, the higher reps in general. Currently now, even for my pressing, I don't do anything lower than 8.
Lower than 8, really? So I want to know, what are your thoughts on, because this idea is floating around, that higher reps actually create more fatigue. And that if you're going to do them, then you have to train to failure, right? That you can't do 2 to 3 reps in reserve anymore. Whereas if you do lower reps, you can leave reps in the tank and it's all good. So how does that get factored in with your original background? Like, so you're doing no less than 8. So what's the highest that you'd go up to? And how's the performance drop off on subsequent sets? I'm just very curious about.
Yeah, for triceps is probably the highest because of elbows, just keeping it safe. It's probably about 25 reps. But in terms of what I've seen, the rep drop off, no.
What I've heard from older people, there seems to be this universal agreement that you're going to have to switch to higher reps at some point, just for the sake of your joints, right? The other side, you're going to hear guys saying, well, lower reps is what keeps your joints healthy. And that's, you need to lift heavier for the tendons and all that. And if you've managed fatigue, then there shouldn't be any problems. But it's like, we don't see that in the real world. So was there something that went wrong with the science? Is there a mechanism that we're unaware of? Like, what exactly, like, what makes more sense?
You know what? I think it's that mid-range. That mid-range sucks. The sets like the old classic 5x5 on squats, dude, those were horrible. Like, everyone, I know you did them because everyone did, right? If you would, 5 sets of 5, constant weight all the way through, they were just awful. It's that mid-range which is just a killer. Again, singles, fine. I could probably do singles right now, all good. But it's that mid-range which sucks. So Yeah, threes. Yeah, that's terrible. I used to hate threes. I would spend a lot of time doing eights, I hate threes. Fives, not so much, but threes are terrible. I could last for threes maybe 2 weeks. So yeah, I think the singles are fantastic. I think the higher ups are good. In my experience, for the older guy, what you're doing is you're trading off the pain, the actual pain of doing higher ups, because they are very painful, for the benefits to your joints. That's the trade-off. So I'm in more pain, but I don't mind the pain. I don't mind good pain. It's the bad pain that it sucks, because I don't want that, and it means I can train less often and all that stuff. So yeah, I think typically for older guys, the trope is the higher reps, and it is common for a reason, because it does work. So yeah, I would say 8 to 12. I don't personally, in my experience, it's not a case that they're harder to recover from. I think the missing link is the joints again. Funnily enough, I actually emailed Brad Schoenfeld about this a couple of years ago, and I asked him to do a study about joint stress. Like, can we do something about this? And I don't know if he's humoring me or not, but he did email back, and he said, "Thanks, good idea. I'll look into it." So, but I think at the moment we're not seeing a lot of work in that area, and that's really the difference maker. I would like to see more studies on in that area, because I think in terms of the recovery, yeah, maybe there's more emotional stress, more systemic stress, but certainly for me, the joints are the limiting factor when I train. Like you were saying, muscles recover lightning fast. So that's the trade-off. Yeah.
Yeah, that would make sense. And I'm assuming even if you are in a fatigue state, first of all, there's the repeated bout effect, so you will get used to it to a certain extent. And at the end of the day, if you accumulated enough volume, it's going to be basically the same thing. And if the joints are a little bit healthier, but you're more systemically fatigued, I mean, does it really matter in the end? So I think it all equates, and that's what we see in the real world. And I do value that. I always look at older lifters like, what are lessons that could be applied to younger lifters? Like, can we take some of those principles in a way that we're still making the maximum rate of progress, but we're lowering injury risk that much more? But what are some absolute things that would make a difference regardless of your age? And especially like if you're young and strong, like, are there some things that you would have done, like knowing what you know now about recovery?
I was in quite a good position because I did a lot of things right. But I think in terms of what I see, for the average young person, I think people can employ a variety of training much more often, because I think people get stuck in camp. This is more of a psychological thing, Alex, but I think people get stuck in camps far too often. So like I would have liked to have seen some of my old high intensity buddies from the year 2000 do some high volume approach training, because they used to burn themselves out. They would burn themselves out, they would get injured, and then they would take 6 weeks off the gym. Well, why not just switch to some high volume training? Equally speaking, I'd like to see some of the guys at the gym now who do really high volume, really controlled squeezy reps. Let's get nasty for a while. Let's Leroy Davis this, and do some hard heavy stuff. Yeah. So I guess if I was to do it all again, I would be less emotional about my decisions to go from different phrases, because I still do move to low volume phrases now, even after everything I've said. I just don't stick to them for a long time because my joints hurt. But I would have done more of a range of stimulus, and I think I would have got better benefits when I was younger. That's been a common theme in this discussion.
So on the topic of recovery, lengthened position exercises, you're going for that weighted stretch. That you can make the argument that you're potentially increasing muscle damage, but it's also more hypertrophic, right? But you can also say that it's harder on the body to recover, and that shortened position exercises, yeah, they're less stimulating, quote unquote, but they are easier to recover from. Like the squeezier stuff is not the same as the stretch stuff, right? So I want to know how that plays a role in your system, if you do a combination of everything, or if you would favor one over the other. And then also, like, what are your thoughts on Cyborg precision technique, like what Dr. Mike recommends, like the slow eccentric, like really focusing on perfect form combined with the higher reps and all that?
I'll say, just to preface, I'm a big Mike fan. I followed him since 2017, I think, when the first time he was on Steve Hall's podcast. So, I do like him. I thought he has a very similar background to me. He used to be a powerlifter and all that kind of stuff. And I think just to go off topic for a second, I think one of the really good things that Mike did for bodybuilding was to systematize bodybuilding. Because when I was coming from powerlifting to bodybuilding, I needed a system. So he systematized it. And people could argue all day long about the system. Should we do 6-week cycles and all that kind of stuff? But the bottom line is he attempted to systematize things. Yeah, he did. So his contributions to the field should be acknowledged. Yeah. So with regards to, first of all, the Cyborg form, I think there is room for everything. I have to say, I'm not a fan of doing that style of lifting exclusively, because I think you need the strength work. I think you need to have, not just for fun, because it is fun, but I think you need to develop your ability to push hard. So I think if we are trying to match that in terms of everything, perhaps do some of the Cyborg stuff for certain lifts, but maybe not for everything. I don't think it would be wise to do your entire program full of the Cyborg type of lifting. I think you need some of the strength work alongside it. When I say strength work, I mean more explosive concentrics, maybe more, controlled eccentrics, just a more traditional bodybuilding style. The traditional bodybuilding cadence I was taught was, it's like you're starting a car engine, fast and then slow, fast and then slow kind of thing. That I think is a better way, because you get more out of it. You get those high muscle units firing, and you get the more of the strength gain. That's what I would say for that. Yeah. But what are your thoughts with that anyway?
My thoughts are that it depends on the exercise and how strong you are. So someone who's benching 315 for reps on the regular might benefit from Cyborg technique, because now you might be back down to 225 or 250, at most 275. So that could be better on recovery, but you're still not weak in a sense. Like you're still putting up respectable numbers, right? Where I think it becomes a problem is if you're not strong and now you're lifting baby weights. But if you're just trying to reduce the absolute load because it's killing you, then I think it's absolutely fantastic. Like I never want to squat 500 ever again, if I'm being honest with you. I prefer squatting the 200s, and that's kind of what I'm doing nowadays. I'm doing a slow control. I'm not dive bombing my squats. I'm pausing. So I love that. The same thing with the belt squat,
What you said there is a great point. That's how I think about it as well. So when I was transitioning from powerlifting to bodybuilding, I was coming with a 400-pound bench. Now that was for a single. So I think at the time I was doing something like 330 for a set of 8, but my bodybuilding weight was 260 for a set of 8. So I went from being a 400-pound bencher to a 260-pound bencher, because all of a sudden elbows are a little bit wider, more control. So yeah, I think there is. That's probably how I would answer. I think you summarized that really well. That's what I would say too. There is room for it. Potentially more applicable when you're stronger, and potentially a guy who's just coming onto the scene maybe needs to be a bit more.
Yeah, I would agree. And I would say that even because when you're weak, you can recover from anything for the most part. Like we were talking before, even someone who starts lifting under 40s, they can bench 3 days a week, lift relatively heavy. It's going to be fine. So it's like novices, in my opinion, shouldn't be focusing too much on that. As long as the form is pretty decent, which you can learn in a couple sessions, I'm sure you do that all the time with your clients, or they can watch like some starting strength tutorials. I think like a normal tempo and not like overly obsessing about perfection will serve them for a number of years,
The problem with beginners, especially, and this can be a related problem to the Cyborg thing, is there's not much of a difference in perceived exertion from, say, 100-pound bench to 105-pound bench. It all just feels heavy to them. And that's a problem. So because they're not very good at pushing hard yet. And that's not, I just want to clarify for the audience, like that's not me saying all young people don't have a backbone or anything. Like it's just a fact. When you're a beginner, I didn't have the ability to push hard when I was a beginner either. No one does. So it's just, you have to get used to pushing hard, which kind of goes back to our discussion about people who've done sports before tend to be better. But if you're a ranked beginner who hasn't done very many sports, I think you have to be able to just focus on adding weight to the bar. But there's a balance, there was a string of people who did the classic strong lifts type of thing years ago, and they were forced to add 5 pounds to the bar every week, and they hurt themselves. So there has to be a balance. Like with everything, there has to be a balance. But I think there's a lot of value in noobs adding weight to the bar, even if they maybe think they're not ready. Like just add 5 pounds, see how it feels. As long as the form's okay, keep going, because it's all going to feel pretty hard.
Yeah, I agree. And again, it's not that we're calling them morons or that we're looking down on them. It's that they just don't have the experience, and we're trying to force it out initially, not that they have to do that for the rest of their lives. And it's also, physiologically, they even have a motor unit recruitment deficit. Like they're not, because they haven't mastered the movement patterns yet, they're physically incapable of going all out. So that's why I like to program lower reps for novices, and I want them focusing on these big, difficult movements, because I need to instill that early on. And I think that with you and your high intensity background, like if you train like that for a year, I mean, you're never going to have an issue with gauging intensity for the rest of your journey. So I view it as more of an investment to learn how to actually dial in your focus, but eventually you do have to pull back, but not early on.
No, I think you worded that perfectly, because it can be quite a sensitive discussion, because essentially you're you're talking about training intensity, which you and I know is just a variable. Like volume's a variable, frequency is a variable. But I think if you're speaking to the uninitiated, it can come across like you're literally saying you're not trying hard enough. But just to reiterate, we're not saying that at all. It's simply a variable that they can improve. Like you say, they have a deficit. So yeah, I think that was perfect. Yeah.
And just to clarify, what are your thoughts on like squeezy movements versus the stretchy stuff for recovery?
So I was talking about this with some clients, and I think that's a missing trick. I do think lengthened movements tend to be more stressful. I certainly find them more stressful, the harder on the body. So as a result, they may well initiate more growth. Although I think that the latest
The latest data showed there was no difference versus full range versus lengthened, but also the lengthened work was like, sorry, the full range was emphasizing the lengthened position. So one can make the argument that the shortened position didn't increase the gains, or you could just say that it doesn't matter. Like pick your preference, or if it's an exercise that will be limited by the shortened position, then just do lengthened partials and call it, like on a T-bar row or whatever, right? So like my interpretation is for movements that naturally have a bad resistance profile, you might as well do lengthened partials because it's not going to make a difference. Like don't grind through a sticking point that's based off the exercise, But yeah, it was saying the difference. Yeah, it's very individual.
Absolutely. I think it's very individual, the exercise. So my thought with that is I think we are kind of missing a trick. With respect to the research, I'm not quite sure about whether we can push in that direction. I think there are a lot of research studies which point to the lengthened partials being good, but I'm not sure the quality is quite there. So I think we have to be a little bit cautious about jumping to conclusions. This study, which you're quoting, was really well done. It was very strong. And I think that points to perhaps the need to look back at the previous research and maybe evaluate what went wrong. Because I think with a lot of the training stuff, Alex, like you'll remember the muscle protein synthesis research.
Yes.
What we don't do very well is we don't look back and try to understand where we went wrong. And I think that's a mistake, because science will give us insights. It will make mistakes, because science is a process. We learn, we build on, and that's what science does. You build on study to study and you start to form conclusions. But I think what we're not very good at doing is, well, why did we take a U-turn there? What was wrong with those studies? And what I would like to see now is maybe going back and looking at the early lengthened partial research and look at
let's revisit it.
Wrong there, just so we can learn, not to point fingers, but just so we can learn. So to answer your question, sorry, with the shortened range stuff, I think we're missing a trick. I still do it. I think set per set, it's probably easier on the joints and on the body. It might have less stimulus potentially, I don't know, but I think there is room within the training to increase the level of volume in a more joint body friendly way. I still program shortened work with my clients. Again, it's that whole case of don't restrict yourself to one way of thinking. Try and benefit from all kinds of things, which I think is sort of unanimous in my coaching.
And I would say there's certain things that we might not fully understand yet about the shortened position. Potentially, maybe you can get more proximal growth. I don't know. Maybe there's something to do with neuromechanical matching. If that turns out to be true, that some muscles benefit based off their leverage in the shortened range, I don't know. I'm not going to claim to be an expert on this. I'll let these guys figure it out with time. Some guys say it improves your density or your striations. That's like ultra bro science, right? But you don't know, because a lot of times the bros turn out to be correct. And when they are corrected, it's like, people don't give them the credit, right? And when they're wrong, it's like, oh, they're morons, right? But when a science person gets it wrong, it's like everyone forgives them so quick when they were making strong conclusions a couple months ago leading up to that point. So I love that you said we need to learn what went wrong. We should be revisiting those studies. And usually the missing link, and I'm sorry, we've been saying this for years, is that they use untrained lifters. And what bothers me the most, Faz, is when they say, oh no, the lifters were trained, but then you look at the 1 rep max or what they were lifting, and they're novices at best. And I'm sorry, I'll even say this, with the 52 set study, I believe their 1 rep max was 315 on the barbell squat. And I saw a video with Dr. Mike and someone else, and he said, yeah, like right on, they're trained. I'm sorry. In my opinion, that's not trained enough for a barbell squat. I was doing that after a year of lifting for reps. You know what I'm saying? Like anyone who's familiar with powerlifting or just strength training, that's nothing. I mean, it's something. I'm not trying to be mean, but like let's see guys who are squatting 500 on the regular, see if they can get away with that and see if the protocols change. And I know they would change, because everyone who's strong has a different conclusion. And that's my issue with the evidence-based space. I'm all for science. I love everything about it. And that's what I've adopted when it comes to nutrition, because I believe in this stuff. And I want to believe in the science when it comes to exercise, because I would do it in a heartbeat. I want to know what's best. But if you're not doing the research correctly, then I can't be on board with it. But like you said, this recent study on lengthened partials versus full range, it was done right. And I can get on board with that and I can apply that. But the other stuff that just doesn't coincide with our experiences, is like, you got to question it. And you found the same thing to be true when it comes to triceps training, right? So it's like, that's kind of how I see it. Like, what would you say?
I would also say over the last probably 50 years, 60 years, we've been conducting a long range, piece of research, and that's just the bodybuilding community, bodybuilding lore. Like, yes, certain things don't work, but I would say over the last 25 years, due to the advent of the internet and information exchange on a global basis, we have become a lot tighter in replicating a winning formula. And I still talk to and hang out with, in person and online, a lot of just regular bodybuilders, guys who have no interest in science whatsoever, just, the wider bodybuilding community. And one thing I do stress in my channel is that what we see in terms of the scientific research, which on our streams, due to the way the algorithm works, is everything, right? Because, it just gets promoted. It's a very small slither of the bodybuilding community. You have got tremendous coaches out there, coaches who are getting people their pro cards every year, naturals, big guys, and their approaches don't always match what we see in the research. In my opinion, we have to respect that. That's what I do with my coaching. So there are certain areas, which I can expand on if you want me to, where I don't follow the current interpretation of the research. Like, I will follow my own interpretation of research, which happens to coincide with bodybuilding law. And I think we have to respect that. You know what it is, Alex? It's just the way the algorithm works. If you're looking at certain people and certain things, that's all you're going to see, and you're going to start to think they represent a larger slice of the pie than they actually do.
That's true. I think certain people are being overrepresented, and ultimately it's about creating something new, because fitness, everything's been done for the most part. Trends come and go. Eventually you start recycling content. So what can I do now that's revolutionary? And it's sad that this industry, which is about health, arguably the most important thing, has been preyed upon. Yeah, the bodybuilding lore can't be discounted. We have decades of experience, and I think a coach's track record is like the ultimate form of real evidence-based training. Like, in the powerlifting scene, pretty much none of them are following protocols found in research papers at the highest level. If you want to see what works, look at the world-class competitors and see where their training aligns. And what you'll find, specifically like in the IPF, for example, they all train the same way. So that's the meta. Look at what those coaches are doing. That's your optimal system.
Yeah, and there are problems with that as well, because it may just be it's like a selection thing. Yeah, it could be all of that as well, exactly. Yeah, or it could just be like a certain type of athlete is fitting those training methods, and that's what's. But yeah, for the most part, I think we're getting better because of the internet and globalization and stuff. So yeah, I think I would just say, when somebody asks me what I think of a certain influencer or a coach, my first question as a coach is, who have they trained? How many pro cards have they won? Who have they peaked? Let me see their clients. And like, if we can't answer that question, like, that's my first reaction. Whereas I think what a lot of people's first reaction is, do they match the science and the research? There is an inherent sort of downplaying of actual achievements there. Look, we're trying to be right because we want to be jacked. We're not trying to be right on the internet. We're trying to be we're not trying to be jacked on the internet. We're trying to be jacked in real life. So I think, and I would also say it's a difficult conversation to have, because
you could wrestle some jimmies with that. Yeah, I get where you're coming from. But I think what you're saying about the coaching is very important, because people are paying you for results. And if what the science says doesn't align with the best practice that you found to be effective, then you're not going to roll with it, because your job is to get people gains, So that's what it boils down to. Like, what's your track record?
I will happily explain my stance to clients if they ask, why is this different from this? And I'm more than happy to do that. But yeah, as I say, there is a much wider bodybuilding community than just what a lot of people see on their algorithms. And my first question is always, who have they coached? Who have they put on stage? Let's see their clients. And that's how I know if they're good or not.
I'm similar. I like to mix in both, but I'm going to value high-level anecdotes among elite natural lifters. To me, that's my ultimate criteria. And when I look at my journey, my best results is when I listen to people who fit that background. And it's still what I do to this day. And I especially value them if they're older and injury-free. Like that's real icing on the cake, and that's what I like about your stuff as well. Like you speak from all ends. Like you've covered everything. That's the biggest lie in the fitness industry.
It's an interesting one because that video, I think it was popular because it seemed to really hit a nerve with a lot of people. People were like, yeah. They were getting outraged in the comments. You know, they were in agreement. So it seems to be something that a lot of people wanted to verbalize but hadn't necessarily been able to.
One thing I did want to ask you about is your meal batching strategy. You're like the only person I've seen who has done this. Could you elaborate on what this genius routine is?
So this all kicked off, I think, in about 2017, 16. So I didn't have much of an interest in diet when I first started training. You know, I was the powerlifter guy, all that. But I was going to do my first bodybuilding show. So I had to like get things sorted. And at the time, I mean, no one really likes cooking. I don't anyway. So I wanted to make sure I had a whole bunch of bodybuilding food ready and prepared. So the key to making it all work is a chest freezer. I have a spare freezer. It's actually behind the desk. So that's different from the freezer. It's in my office. So that's different from the freezer like my wife and I have in the kitchen. So I have my own chest freezer, which is a dip-in freezer. It's very big. And that's the key to making it all work. So what I would do is I would make enough. Let's say usually I'll talk you through what I normally have on tap. Rice, potatoes, some kind of beans, usually in some kind of sauce, and then chicken and fish. So at any given point, I will have anything up to 3 to 4 weeks worth of one of those in the freezer. And there's enough room because it's the freezer and it's all mine. The wife doesn't keep anything there. But that's the way to make it work. And I can do 4 weeks worth of potatoes in one Sunday morning. So I'm back from the gym, 9 o'clock on Sunday. I'll spend a few hours just going back and forth on the computer, maybe just, gaming or whatever, and just checking on potatoes. And that's 3 hours and I've done a month worth. So most weeks, I don't have to cook anything. Most weeks, I get it out of the freezer, put it into the fridge the night before, and I can portion it out and I'm good to go. So I will still create some kind of meal plan for myself because that's the way I like to work. But even if you didn't do a meal plan, you could, whatever your method was, you just have ready food available, which you've cooked yourself. So that's more cost effective. It's also tasty. You can make it however you like it to make it. And anything you're not currently using, stick it in the freezer. But the key to making it work, Alex, is the chest freezer. I spent something like the equivalent of $200 on a chest freezer. Absolutely nothing. I did that 5 years ago, and it's still going strong. It is the best. I made a reel about this. The best bodybuilding accessory, chest freezer. That was the thing. So yeah, it's great. But I still do that. Still works. I have a bunch of rice and potatoes made.
What I found, because I saw your video, then I decided to try it. And what I realized also is you can't just stick it in one giant Tupperware, or else the food is frozen and you can't portion it. So you have to do it per Tupperware, right?
Yes. So I would buy more hundreds of 700 milliliters containers, disposable. I mean, you can use them again, but just anything. I found them on Amazon. You'll find them, there as well, or eBay, or even Temu. Just get a whole bunch in, and just smaller ones, because at some point you've got to take that from your freezer into your fridge the night before, and you don't want too much at a time because you want it to last maybe a couple of days max, because then you don't want it to go off or stale or whatever. You want it to be nice and fresh. So yeah, the key to making it work is the chest freezer, and also relatively small boxes, I think is a good way to go. But it does work. I still do it.
And so you take these meals out the night before, and is it like you'll pull out 3 Tupperwares kind of thing? Like how many?
So the key point is they're not full meals. They're just one ingredient. So it'll be a tub full of potatoes or mashed potatoes, another tub full of rice, another tub full of chicken, another tub full of whatever else. And so at any given point at the bottom of the fridge, just the regular fridge, I'll have 4 or 5 of these boxes with different ingredients made the way I like, just the way I like. And then all I do, if I'm currently doing my macros and calories, I'll just weigh it out, put it in the microwave, and off I go.
Okay. So you can portion it after the fact. Yeah. Or else it becomes a more time consuming process, having to do everything like the perfect amount of grams per Tupperware, right? So you just have the ingredients and then you mix and go and you're ready. And you'll eat the same thing throughout the entire day. Like you don't care that it's, that's bodybuilding, right?
Yeah, that's bodybuilding. Yeah. I need to eat quite a lot, and a lot of it's just chicken and rice. But yeah, you can mix it up. So I could have chicken and fish there, so I can mix it up. I could have potatoes and rice, I can mix it up. I could have beans and something else, I can mix it up. And also, I'm not concerned about adding other things to it too. So if I want to make something fresh, I'll happily make it fresh. But the point is, it'll cut down on the majority of your day-to-day cooking.
How many calories would you estimate? 3,000, 3,500?
Yeah, maintenance for me right now is 3,300. So if I was to bulk, it'd be closer to 4,000, I think. Because I train 6 days a week, also do cardio every day. That's just how I like. I think I found, Alex, as I'm older in my 40s, I feel like I have to do something every day because I just don't feel great if I don't. Today's an exception just because we're doing this podcast. Today I decided to take a relaxation day, but normally, even on a day off, if I'm not training, I will do half an hour of hard cardio. So I like to do something every day. So yeah, as a result, that also drives up my maintenance as well. But yeah, about 3,300. I'm right now 205 pounds, about 5'11".
And that's good news to people who like eating a lot of food. That you can stay that way on 3,000 plus, as opposed to the average sedentary male who's getting 2,000. I couldn't imagine, because that's 2,000 calories on a jack guy will get you shredded.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's a big thing I see, Alex, is you'll see this as well as you get into your 40s. You'll see people you grew up with who insisted on doing the cardio thing to stay lean and not doing lifting. In their 40s, they're going to be really worse off because they're still going to have to restrict themselves to 2,000 calories. And a lot of those guys can't be bothered. And a lot of times I think to myself, God, I mean, I'm not sure I want to do another contest prep because I'm not sure I want all that restriction. So at my age, if I didn't have the muscle mass that I have now, I think I'd really struggle. I think I'd be quite fat. So yeah, I think the trick to staying lean later in your life is building a ton of muscle. Yeah, like you're in a great position. I mean, you've built a ton of mass now at your age. Like you'll be fine. But you'll see a lot of some people,
And I'm guessing you don't overly obsess about the macros or anything like that. Like as long as you're getting sufficient calories, whole foods, basic protein requirements, it's not because it seems like in the enhanced world, or at least some influencers, they make it seem like diet is everything. But I find that programming is more important. Once you have the fundamentals down, it's like if you look at the noble natties, for example, none of them are making extensive videos about nutrition. I feel like that plays more role when we're talking about health, like certain antioxidants and the best micronutrients out of X food or whatever. But like for gains, it's really not that complicated.
This on my member site because I do have some enhanced clients on the books, and they were asking me, look, how do you coach enhanced clients? Like, how does that work? And I said, look, the only guys I coach who are enhanced are the guys who are on like a really small amount of stuff where the programming remains the same. Because the difference is, to your point, if these guys who are on a lot of juice, their coach is not really doing a bunch of programming, it's just health management at that point. That's the main, everything is down to health management. Their training is down to health management. Their diet is all down to health management. The drugs will drive the bus. So every decision they do outside of the drugs is all for health management. So like you were saying, they'll have this really extra hyper-focused sort of viewpoint on nutrition to all for the sake of staying healthy. It's, to give you an analogy, it's almost like you're trying to be a functional alcoholic. You've got this stress on your body all the time. You're trying to manage your health. Like how would you train somebody? How would you lifestyle coach somebody if to allow them to be an alcoholic at work? Well, the diet would have to be spot on. The nutrition have to be spot on. Their training would have to be to the point of being as healthful as possible. So, we were talking before about the higher density, higher volume approaches and all that. I think part of the reason of the popularity of some of those approaches is because it comes from drug-fueled circles. And, they're just trying, if you're doing 20, 25 sets per body part per week, it's probably going to burn more calories and be better for your cardiovascular system than if you were doing a gut busting, set of top set, back off set, which is going to raise your blood pressure and everything. So, yeah, I think that's kind of like where I come from in this. I'm not massively obsessed with the health side of things. The only difference I will say is I do tend to have higher protein recommendations than most evidence-based guys.
Run me through that. Like, what would your average recommendation be?
My thoughts are that the research is fine, but my thoughts are the interpretation of the research is not great. And I think over the next 5 years, we're probably going to have that as the next.
That's going to be the next flip-flop. Because now another meta-analysis came out. Like previously, like Menno Helmsman was saying, you want 0.8 grams of protein per pound of body weight. Now he brought it down to 0.73. So it seems to be getting even lower. Your guess is that it's going to do the opposite? It's going to go back to the pound per body weight or even beyond?
Yeah, I think it should do, because I think I've certainly seen better results that way, and that's more in line with bodybuilding law. So my interpretation of the research, and again, nothing wrong with the research, I think it's the interpretation. My interpretation of the research is they are measuring muscle protein synthesis. Now, the issue with that is there's two problems with that, two main problems to break it down for the audience, right? The first problem is we are not just concerned about replenishing muscle with the protein we eat. There are other structures in the body which have a protein requirement, such as your organs, your skin, your nails, your bones, even all that stuff, right? So the only measurement is muscle protein synthesis. So again, nothing wrong with the research. It's the interpretation of the research. So the research does not measure the additional things which have a protein requirement. So that's the first mistake. So that will elevate the amount of protein we need, practically speaking, more than the current recommendations. The second thing, which is just as impactful, is the fact it only measures synthesis, not degradation. Now, the net balance of synthesis and degradation is what results in muscle protein accretion. So we can't just measure synthesis. We have to measure degradation also. And now you combine both those together, protein requirements have to be higher than the 0.8 grams given for just muscle protein synthesis. So my recommendation, I'm not sure there is a top range, but my recommendation, which I personally feel good on, is 1.5 grams per pound of roughly lean to body weight. So for example, as a 200-pound man, I have about 275 to 300 grams of protein daily. I've been doing that for about 4 years, and I would say recovery is better because you also got to bear in mind, I think to myself, what if I had this with protein when I was at my prime lifting what I lifted? Like, I probably would have had a better joint recovery because joints are one of the structures which has a protein requirement. So if what I would say to the audience, if you're skeptical about that, just understand that this is not going to be a requirement for you unless you are advanced and are putting a lot of stress on your body. If you're a noob and you're benching a couple of plates aside, then you can probably get away with 0.8 grams per pound. But when you get to the point where you're lifting serious numbers and you're looking for the edge, think of it as a lever you can pull. The Fazlifts loyal viewers will like my levers analogy. I use that a lot. But think of it as a lever you can pull. When you're at that point where your gains are on the knife edge, increase your protein. Try 1.5 grams per pound or per lean pound. Just try it. And if you're at that point, you're more than likely going to feel some benefit. I think recovery for me is fantastic. It's far improved. If I was to eat, and I've tried it, 0.8 grams per pound, it's a disaster for me. I have seen that research about older people needing more protein. So that's a possibility. I don't know because I only started doing the higher protein myself over the last 4 years, so I can't really say that in. But I will say for my clients, and here's another advantage, for my clients who are willing to go that extra distance because it is more uncomfortable and it costs more. For those clients, I can generally have them bulk more aggressively and not get fat. So we're looking at more like maybe 2 or 3 pounds a month rather than 1 or 2 pounds per month. That's what I've seen.
That's going to be my next lead-on question. Like, how does bulking play a role in this? A lot of people now are talking about main gaining. How have your thoughts on bulking changed over the years? And how does that get mixed in with the topic of this high protein?
So I think it's contextual. Myself being about 200 pounds, I could main gain here quite comfortably. Gain small amounts of muscle if I'm setting my day up correctly. So I have high protein, I do my cardio, my output's high, and my input's high. I could main gain here, and that's kind of what I'm doing. If somebody weighs 130 pounds and let's say they're 5'10" and they need to gain weight, like I think for them, bulking is a strategy which they need to seriously consider because they're not going to be at the point where they can't main gain themselves into 175 in stage shape. So I just think it's very practical. Now, generally speaking, I do quite like bulk and cut cycles. I think they work really well, and so while I'm a fan of main gaining, I'm in a very unusual population, so it works for me if I want to do it, but I still bulk and cut. I still think bulk and cutting is the best way. Every big natural, and you're really good at this, Alex, because I know you did the same thing and you keep saying the same message, which is great. Like I love that because a lot of people will change their mind. They'll be like, well, they got the most of their muscle with heavy bulks and cuts, but then they'll turn around at the end of their career and go, right, that's not the way to go. There's that lifting amnesia. I'm pretty sure there's a term I coined, lifting amnesia, and I don't like it because I try and avoid that with myself because I know I'm one of the older crowd, so it would be easy for me to have that lifting amnesia. But I try to remain grounded and just point at things that did work, not things that I think hypothetically could work. So for me, I did all my best lifting with bulking and cutting cycles. I think the majority of good lifters did. I do think main gaining is a decent option for some people. Let me give you a scenario where it's a good option. So I've got a guy on the books right now. He came to me wanting to cut. So we started off cutting, and due to the fact that he had tried to cut so much over the last year, he had built up so much diet fatigue, he wasn't able to. He got a couple of weeks into diet and he was like, no, I'm binging left, right, center. I don't know what to do. Now, in that situation, I need to alleviate some diet fatigue from him. But at the same time, and let's just define that for a second. I think I'm not sure how well studied it is because I've not looked into it, but I think there's such a phenomenon that if you've been trying to diet for so long, even the attempts at dieting can fatigue you. So it's not just doing a diet, but let's say you've been attempting to diet, but you've done it really poorly. So you diet, you binge, it's just bad. I think you suffer the effects of diet fatigue, and it's more a psychological stress. So if you go back into a deficit, you're going to feel that stress. So you need a time away from trying to diet. So in that situation, I might not want to bulk, especially if he's going to be uncomfortable with body fat gain. So I might maintain. In that situation, main gaining to alleviate diet fatigue is fantastic. In another situation, somebody might just not want to diet. They might be quite happy with where they are. I have another client on the books right now. He's about 110 kilos. It's a happy weight for him. He's been 110 kilos his entire life, but he's been fatter before. So he's not wanting to cut because he has a very busy job, very demanding. He doesn't want to stress. He also doesn't want to bulk because he doesn't want to get any fatter. So we've been main gaining for 6 months and he's looking different. His shoulders are wider. His traps have grown. His chest has grown. He's looking better. And he's happy because he's just a regular dude. He's a father. He works a regular job. And he's getting compliments now. People say, hey, you look stacked. And he's not had to go through the deprivation of a diet or the uncomfortableness of a bulk. So there are situations, as always, it's contextual. There are situations where it can work. But I would say if I was to get, a young Alex 10 years ago, I would have you bulking and cutting because you are.
Even to this day, like as much as I want to main gain, it's like I know that bulking and cutting is still more effective at this current time frame, and I probably could get away with it maintaining a body weight of like 181, but I know that if I have that small surplus, the recovery is better. There's more consistent strength PRs, and especially for certain lifts like the bench press, in a way, it kind of is weight dependent. There's always that curiosity in the back of my mind, like if I gain an extra 5 pounds of fat, like what will that do? You get better at bulking and cutting. You can do it seamlessly, even in the same year, and you learn how to preserve your tissue. You learn how to program for both phases. So it's not a difficult process. As long as you could adhere to it, you're going to have more muscle every time on the way up and down. What is the optimal body fat percentage for natural lifters? What should be the comfortable range? And what are your thoughts on this hyperfixation on being shredded?
So it's a great question because it's a classic question, and I think the origin of that question boils down to, again, bodybuilding law. And that is everyone in the wider bodybuilding community knows that you grow best out of a cut. Now, why is that? And I think I have my reasons. Okay. I don't necessarily think the P ratio thing is legit. I don't think it is. For a short period of time, I did believe in that. But from what I've seen, I don't think it's legit. I think what actually happens is on the way down in a cut, you get better at bodybuilding. You have to refine your processes. You refine you have to define your diet approach. You get better. Every calorie counts, every morsel counts. So you make it count, and you have to get more precise with your training too, because you don't have as much energy. So you're bodybuilding, but like it's like walking through quicksand. You have to be very efficient with what you're doing every step. And I think that carries forward to a really good bulk. And so the problems of people saying that if you're at a certain body fat percentage, you're not going to gain, I think that's due to lifestyle. It's all lifestyle stuff again. Because if you've got a guy who's 30 to 35% body fat and people say, oh, well, you're never going to gain. Well, what are the habits? What are the diet strategies that led that guy to being 35%? I mean, I can guarantee you it's not 300 grams of protein and training 6 days a week.
Good point.
Yeah, it's probably a lifestyle which lends itself to being 35% body fat, which is not, like we've discussed throughout this podcast, the need for being a bit more of a holistic bodybuilder is evident in trying to attain the next level. So I think the P ratio stuff is a little bit overblown. I don't think it's down to that. I think in essence, I think historically the bodybuilding law is correct, but I think for the wrong reasons. I don't think it's a P ratio thing. I think it's just a case of amplifying how good of a bodybuilder you are, because you know this as well as everyone, Alex. It's when you're trying to teach somebody how to lift. What I do is I try to teach them how to be a bodybuilder. That's the goal, or a powerlifter. But I'm trying to teach people how to be a bodybuilder. How do you lift correctly? How do you eat correctly? How do you do all that correctly? And a diet magnifies that. So this idea of an ideal body fat percentage, I think, stems from this question of the validity of the P ratio, I don't think there is an ideal body fat percentage at all. What I think there is being a good bodybuilder or not. And I think we should all aim to be better lifters, whatever our thing is, whether it's powerlifting or strongman or bodybuilding, it's all equal, It's all a bit about P ratio and this and that. But I think that's the reality that I've seen.
That's a very good point. I hadn't even thought about it in that way. But it does make you question the P ratio. Again, I love that you keep using this word bodybuilding lore, because we can't forget about that. We can't take an average obese person who's not eating good foods, not training in a hardcore style, who certainly doesn't have the numbers or the muscle mass to back it up, to say that being at, say, 25% body fat is killing your gains, Because in reality, we seem to see the opposite. Like everyone who even bloat maxes, it's almost like they break the natural limit, quote unquote. Everyone who does a gigaball, quote unquote, they all gain crazy amounts of strength and size. And it's faster progress. It's better progress, better recovery. Like you said, the diet is amplifying the training. I said this a couple of years ago, but when I got shredded for the first time is when I realized what real programming was all about. Because you learn what your true fatigue is, and you're not just masking it with diet, right? But once you have that understanding, what's the optimal volume for you, the best exercise, all that, the best way to preserve strength, right? Then you apply that in a caloric surplus and you gain a little bit heavier than you would have liked. I mean, the gains don't appear to be worse. And that's just what we've seen throughout the decades, So I think it makes us question this idea of the hormones and all that. And again, going back to what we said earlier, does it really matter if you have a higher estrogen or whatever? It might not. I think that is overrated for natural lifters. Also, if you're eating in a healthful way, like you're not lacking in micronutrients, you're just eating more of the same thing. So it's like we're not telling people to eat like complete slobs either, although that'll still work for building size, crazy enough. So I think your take is by far the best. I'm just curious, how does body dysmorphia get factored in to like the topic of bulking and cutting? And have you ever personally dealt with this? So how has that been as an elite lifter?
I think at a certain point, like everyone's going to hit their last PR. You're going to be as big as you were, and you're going to start to downsize. And I think there is an adjustment period. Just speaking from experience, I think my best was probably 2018, 19. And as big as I am now, I put all my training on my stories on Instagram so people can see for themselves. I'm still downsized to where I was. Not massively so, but I am. And I think oftentimes that can be difficult. But something I heard Alberto Nunes say recently, which he got from Ron Partlow, was something, I can't remember the exact quote, but it's a case of you have to understand when bodybuilding is giving you something as opposed to when you are just doing bodybuilding for the sake of it providing something in your life which it should be accomplished by other things. Like right now, a lot of people ask me whether I'm competing again. It's always the question, especially guys a lot of the guys on YouTube, they've only known me for 3 years, but there's a whole 20 years prior to that, right? So a lot of people want to see that. They want to see prime Faz. And so in terms of me, I'm not sure actually competing is going to give me what I need. Bodybuilding right now gives me everything I need because I get from it what I want, which enriches my life. I'm a better person, husband, coach because I bodybuild. I go to bed on time. I eat my meals on time. I exercise every day. I'm a better person, right? If I was to compete, it would be for the wrong reasons because it wouldn't help. I think you've got to understand sort of when it's time to hang up the boots and call it a day. Because it's no longer serving you. The last thing you want to do is do that one last bodybuilding competition when your life is a disaster. So, yeah, I get satisfaction nowadays from my clients. I get it from my friends, and other places. When I was younger, it was powerlifting and bodybuilding were very different reasons, which aren't there anymore.
But with that said, so these people don't know your 20-year history with that, but do you still feel any pressure at all to maintain a certain standard, or you've really you've come to terms with what you want and you're not gonna change for anybody kind of thing? Like, how has the internet influence your actions?
I think for the most part I have, but it was a difficult transition. Certainly when I downsized in 2020, it was a difficult transition because it was the first time people saw me downsized and it was difficult. So, but again, I think to myself, with injuries, with age, probably hormonal factors as well, you are going to slow down. You're going to get smaller. It's just the way it is. But I think if you're getting a lot of pressure from external sources like the internet or certain friends, they're maybe not the right friends for you. If they're constantly reminding you of how good you were. So I always get it in a very nice way.
That's it. They're not happy for you now. That's the thing, right? You know they're not the right people.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So that's what I would say for people struggling with that. There will be a time when we all, are as big as we were and we'll start to decline, or we're as strong as we were. But I think you've got to have enough things going on in your life to make up for whatever bodybuilding was giving you before, whatever your size was giving you. Like right now, business is going fantastic. My marriage is great. I have great friends. I feel loved and fulfilled and challenged, and that's it.
Because we're doing this natural way and you're peaking later in life, for you it was at 38. I mean, your life should be in order by that time. You still feel like it's not, then bodybuilding is not the solution. It never was. It should enrich everything that led up to that point. So I think understanding that it's a slow journey and that you're going to peak later, that's what should be encouraging when we talk about body dysmorphia, because it'll all come full circle.
But bodybuilding is really just a vehicle for self-improvement. That's what you kind of realize after all these years. I feel so blessed that I did manage to start this, 25 years ago. It could have been something else, I could have given it up along the way, but whatever I did in my life, right, this was definitely a big right thing that I did to do lifting and stick with it. Yes, so I love it. I have no regrets.
So after 25 years, I mean, you're going to be approaching your 30-year mark soon of bodybuilding. That's insane. What are you looking forward to in the future?
At the moment, I would say my goals are all related to business. So this is where the whole concept of bodybuilding serving you comes into play. Like bodybuilding for me right now does everything that I needed to do to help me improve my business, my life, my friendships, and everything else in other ways. Not just business, that sounds too clinical, but just my general enjoyment of life. My ideal day, my time with friends, family, and just being happy. So that's what I'm looking forward to, is continuing to be able to live my life. And bodybuilding lets me do that.
On that note, I would like to ask you, though, one final question. And that is, for my younger audience, what's the one major lesson that you can share with them that'll save them a lot of time and frustration moving forward? And if you could go back in time, I know you did a lot of things right, but what would be that one thing that would make all the difference? What is your ultimate message?
The big thing that I say on my channel a lot is your only loyalty is to your results. One of the things I wish I had done better when I was younger was to trust my instincts. Like if something is working for me, just because I read something, I have an idea about something else, or somebody has said something, doesn't, or nowadays it's like research or whatever it is, don't change. If it works for you, keep doing it, because time is not on your side. Like a blink of an eye ago, I was 19 starting lifting. In another blink, I'm going to be 65 and retired. So time is of the essence. If something works for you, grab onto it, hold onto it, and just stick to it. Don't be swayed by what other people, what other things tell you. You and your training log are your best teachers. Not me, not anybody else online. Your only loyalty is to your results.
Trust yourself. It's as simple as that.
Yeah, you get better at that when you're older, of course.
Oh yeah, 100%. Well, in general, you shared so many gems today. You are a master at explaining yourself. And before I even think of asking another question, you've already addressed it. So you've been bang on the whole time. Your passion is contagious, and I've learned some stuff as well just talking to you one-on-one, in addition to so many of your videos. If people want to learn more about you, where can they do so?
So firstly, I just want to thank you, Alex. You've been an amazing host. For those of you who are still watching this, this is the first time Alex and I have actually spoken, on video, face to face, and I felt it's been such a natural riffing off each other. I think it's been fantastic. It's like talking to an old friend. So I really appreciate your ability as a podcast host is fantastic. It really is. Thank you so much for what you do for the community as well. You help bring smaller content creators like me to the fore, and everyone knows you for that, and everyone loves you for that. So you've got a great place in the community. So thank you massively for letting me be on, and I've really enjoyed our talk. In terms of where people can find me, I'm Fazlifts on everything. Really, the main platform for me is YouTube. I'm occasionally on Instagram, but if you have sort of coaching inquiries, if you want to get coached by me, there are links in the description. Also, I'm on Bootcamp as well, so I should give them a plug because they've been really nice to me. I have 4 programs on there currently, 3 free ones that you can use, and 1 which is a paid one. So I also have a range of ebooks and consultations and services. You can all find them on my website, fazlifts.com.
Well deserved, and I'll be sure to place all those links in the description box. Guys, that's all for today. Check out Fazlifts, subscribe right away, and we will see you next time.